Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I welcome you to our conference on robotics. I will continue in German. Ich freue mich sehr.
I'm very pleased that you're all here today. It's a very important topic for a political group like the Social Democrats. And we here are trying to have an impact on this cutting-edge technology as it develops. This doesn't always have to be something we just observe. We should be able to shape this process as well. As a political group, we've set down some important markers. We have produced a decisive report within the Parliament. It was Madi Delvaux, who's sitting here, who produced the first report on the effects of robotics in terms of its ethical and logistical questions. She looked into what the legal effects would be. A few days ago, a robot actually received citizenship, and that was in Saudi Arabia. This new citizen is called Sophia, and she has a lot more rights than women in Saudi Arabia do. That just shows us the kind of developments that we're going to be confronted with. And we have to be able to structure and foresee those developments. We also need to address the social consequences. We are in favor of progressive developments in technology, but we don't want to see a situation where people are no longer required or needed. That's a major challenge for us. And that's something that we discussed for the first time with the Delvaux reports. We talked about basic income, taxation. It was also very interesting that in the Parliament we weren't able to have our demand honoured that robots should be taxed, and that is now something that has been demanded at an international level in various fora. So I'd like to thank Maddie very much indeed for all the work she's done in this area. Just a few hours ago, we unfortunately got a message saying that the Commissioner wouldn't be able to take part, and instead Mr. Calbour is here, who is the Deputy Director of the Commissioner's Cabinet. It's a real shame that she wasn't able to make it, but we realised that these things do happen, and our group president is going to be joining us later. So go ahead, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me just repeat the greetings from Commissioner Gabriel, who is very sorry that she can't be here. We actually put a lot of work in the preparation, and it was just a last-minute change in the programming of the Bulgarian government's visit to the Commission today that prevented her from being here right now with you. And she has asked me to come on her behalf and to not just speak on her behalf, but to actually use her words. So I will do that without further ado. So please pardon my French pronunciation. The speech is in French. Chers membres du Parlement européen, mesdames et messieurs, l'intelligence artificielle offre un potentiel énorme pour notre économie et pour le progrès de notre société. Nouveaux produits, nouveaux services et une productivité croissante pour chacun de nous et pour chaque entreprise. Il est essentiel que l'Europe se positionne en échelle mondiale afin de tirer le maximum de bénéfices de ce développement.
This is translation in 5 languages.
The English translation is not working. I see your mic.
I think we have a technical problem and that console doesn't work. So just a minute, please.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Shall I repeat this?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So, mesdames et messieurs, l'intelligence artificielle offre un potentiel énorme pour notre économie et pour le progrès de notre société.
Robotics is essential for progress in our societies, and this is an area where it's essential that Europe takes a position so it can gain the most from these developments. Every day the list is longer of robotic applications. In the near future we will all deal with intelligent machines and services which will simplify our daily lives. Artificial intelligence and robotics are key elements of the digital transformation which is underway. These will have a major effect on European society and economy, and they need to benefit from that. In October, the European Commission said that it wanted to concentrate on these developments until 2018. There are 3 axes. First of all, the automobile sector, where more developments need to be stimulated along the value chain to make sure that Europe is at the forefront of the strategic sector, and that will require major investments. There also need to be the right framework conditions for the digital single market. Ladies and gentlemen, robotics and artificial intelligence are driving forces in sectors such as healthcare and agriculture. These sectors will benefit. There will be quicker diagnosis of diseases. There will be better uses of pesticides. Robotics can be used to support people, and you won't need human drivers anymore. The European Commission has recognized the importance of robotics and artificial intelligence and wants to support developments in this area. A public-private partnership was created, Spark, with 700 million euros in subsidies from the European Commission. Spark is one of the major robotics research programs in the world. There's also been 1 billion euros invested in factories of the future, where technology is helping factories to better adapt to the market. We will invest 500 million extra euros in the coming years to create an artificial intelligence platform which will be open and accessible to all. With this platform, all users will be able to use the very latest algorithms in their products. We need to be able to use artificial intelligence so that everyone can benefit from it. The international competition is strong, but Europe has a good commercial position. Half of all the service robots are produced in Europe, and a great deal of that technology comes from Europe. We need to be vigilant to make sure that our companies stay competitive, but we also want to make sure that robotics and artificial intelligence have European values and respect privacy and data protection. The report prepared by Madame Delvaux has outlined various avenues that we can explore and highlighted the main issues. The revolution which is underway will have a major impact on working conditions in the future. That's something that's often debated in the press, but also among the general public. It's also a source of concerns for European citizens. The Digital Jobs and Skills Coalition was launched in 2016 to reduce the deficit in digital skills and help Europeans in their work and home lives. Robots could be used to do the difficult and dangerous jobs, inspecting industrial plants, but they can also be applied in healthcare, agriculture, and in industry. Robots are most valuable when they collaborate with humans rather. Nurses can work better when they have a robot to help them. But we also need to tackle the digital challenges, make sure that robots are at the service of humans and that they can work together with workers. There are several legal issues as well. Even though we shouldn't underestimate the performance of robots today, we're far from a Hollywood-style robotic revolution. The fact that we haven't had all these technical developments also goes hand in hand with not having the right legal framework. There's the directive on machines that can be applied here, as well as the directive on faulty goods, and these could potentially be revised. Ladies and gentlemen, the framework program that will come into force after Horizon 2020 will work on developing artificial intelligence and robotics in Europe, keeping Europe competitive in this area, using innovative smart technology, and this will help us address the crucial issues that will be at stake in the future. As far as I'm concerned, it's already clear that we need to be extremely ambitious in terms of budgeting and European cooperation if we want to improve our position in the global market or even keep it. There's huge potential for economic development here and social progress without ignoring the challenges which these areas present. Europe needs to take action now so that it's considered as a leader in this area. Thank you.
Merci.
Recht herzlichen Dank. Gibt es
Sorry.
Thank you very much indeed. Would anyone like to ask a question? I think that was all very clear. I can't see anyone asking for the floor, so perhaps now I could hand over to Mia Plitter. She is now going to be the moderator for the first section this afternoon. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do we have the video conference readiness now for the next speaker? Just to start with a
video
technological question. So the next topic, and thank you on my behalf for the Gabriel's cabinet and her team. Very, very important, as Parliament has been actively also asking the Commission to act. And as we know, the Waldro nice report on the robotics is really setting a ground that there will be support and willingness from the European side, also the Parliament side, to see some actions on the robotics. And I just may give a short notice that European Parliament had the public consultation on the robotics, which was released on 6th of October, and the consultation were open for all EU citizens. And then there was one general public survey and one survey targeted to specialist audience. And then there are some trends from this consultation that they showed that despite the positive attitudes of the Europeans towards the technology, the majority of the respondents were concerned about the privacy interest and the possible threat of artificial intelligence and robotics to the humanity. So we recognize that the people recognize that it is a good thing and that is a possibility for the Europeans, but we do have some concerns on the questions that we can put on the next title, which is the ethical questions. So when, is it ready? Yes, so the first speaker will take this ethical aspect. He is Oliver Bendel. We have him probably from Switzerland. He is the professor at the School of Business in University of Applied Sciences and Arts in northwestern Switzerland. He is formerly acted as a supervisor of the engineering and science department in several universities in Germany and Switzerland, and his main research interests are information ethics and machine ethics. And we know him from the book. He's the author of the book titled Moral in the Machines. So with these concerns from the European citizens and maybe from the Parliament also, that I ask him to give the presentation on this ethical aspect of the robotics. Please welcome and join us by the video. Mr. Pendle, please.
It is not technically possible to have interpretation from the video conference.
Either yet. We cannot hear you yet.
No voice.
No voice. It is, yeah. Yes. Yeah, I understand. But yeah, but we cannot hear anything. Yeah, we will probably have him in English. There's no interpretation for this part, but then the problem is that we don't hear any voice. Do we get some voice here?
Huh?
Let's have a new try. If it doesn't function, then we have to go on. But
we need a robot to fix it. A robot would fix it. Yeah.
Works then?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
now
Yes.
we can. Perfect. Yes.
Ah, perfect.
Great.
I'm happy.
Good.
Thanks a lot.
Please, you can speak now.
Oh, okay, perfect. Thank you so much for your kind invitation. I would like to switch to some slides, and I would like to skip my browser because of some echoes. Just 1 minute, please. Okay, I close my browser now, and okay. Now I hope I can share my slides. I start with it. Okay. No. Yes. Yes. Can you see my slides? Yes, perfect. Okay, so I would like to talk about service robots from the perspective of ethics, and I would like to explain what information ethics is and what machine ethics is. That's my first task. So information ethics deals with the morality of the information society and in the information society. And it researches how we behave or should behave in moral terms when we offer or use ICT and information systems. That's information ethics. And examples are medical ethics and business ethics for other fields of applied ethics. So information ethics is one example for the fields of applied ethics. So machine ethics is something very different. I would say information ethics is a reflection discipline, and machine ethics is rather a design discipline. It refers to the morality of semi-autonomous or autonomous machines, for example, of robots, bots, or software systems. They become special moral agents, and some of them are moral machines, some of them are immoral machines. Such machines have been known for some years, at least as simulations and prototypes. My colleague Pereira in Lisbon, for example, he is researching in the field of simulations, and he constructed a very interesting simulation where a robot should save a princess. I prefer to build prototypes like chatbots or also hardware robots. Okay, so let's come to the service robots. Service robots are spreading in households, in leisure gardens, in shopping malls, in hospitals and nursing homes. They take over both simple and complex activities. They inform, support, and monitor people. And let's have a look at the first example. It's a care robot from Recon, a Japanese company. It's available as prototype, and it can be used in tandem with a caregiver to move the patients around and straighten them up. It looks like a friendly bear, and I don't think that's everybody's taste. Imagine you wake up and you can see a bear at your bed. So first of all, I would like to have some questions from the specific ethics, for example, from information ethics and business ethics. Who is responsible for incorrect care? That's the first question. Can the robot help to avoid kind of shame you would have people? In an unrepresentative study, we found that some patients would prefer to be watched by a robot in the intimate area rather than by a human being. Then another question, how do you proceed with the personal data that is collected and evaluated? And the last question from the specific ethics, is the robot a competitor for the nursing staff? And now I would like to switch the perspective, and I would ask some questions from the perspective of machine ethics. Let's remember, machine ethics is a design discipline, and it's about putting morality into the machine. So the first question could be, should the robot make clear that it's just a machine? So should it destroy the illusion? The second question is, how should it behave in dilemmas? For example, if several people should be supervised. And the last question from machine ethics, how will it react if the patient wants it to kill him? That's possible in some cases. Some care robots could kill patients, especially those who are cooperation and collaboration robots, so-called co-robots. Let's come to the second example. I met this security robot from Nightscope last year in Silicon Valley. It's the K5. It's a security and I would say surveillance robot. It's very heavy and it can't speak. It can't tell anything. I tried to speak with it, but it was not possible, unfortunately. It travels autonomously in shopping malls like the Stanford Shopping Center, and on company premises. It's equipped with AI, and it reports suspects to a central office. From the perspective of information ethics, of technology ethics, and of business ethics, we could ask some questions again. Who is responsible for a collision with humans or animals? There was a little accident last year. The K5 collided with a little boy in Silicon Valley. Next question, how should the analysis and monitoring in this context be assessed? As I mentioned, it could be a surveillance robot. Is the security robot competitor to the security staff? That's the third question. Now again, let's switch perspective, and I would like to ask two questions from the perspective of machine ethics. Should security robot be able to carry out actions such as arrest on its own? That's one question. And the other question, should it be allowed to use a weapon on its own? And if so, in which cases and against which person? That sounds very funny, but a Chinese colleague of K5 has a stun gun. However, he cannot operate it itself at the moment. My third example, I met this robot last year nearby Bern in Switzerland. It's a very cute little robot, and I was allowed to open it and have some insights. It's a transport robot from Starship Technologies. This transport robot transports parcels or foodstuffs, for example, and it can be found on public roads and on public walkways. It moves autonomous from A to B, but partly remote controlled in some places and spaces. Again, some questions from the specific ethics. The first question is, who bears the responsibility if people stumble upon the robot or if animals bite into it? You really can stamp upon it. It's very small. It's like a little dog, for example. Another question, a little bit funny perhaps, what if the robot can look under the skirt or kilt? And how do you proceed with the corresponding data? The third question, is the robot a competitor again for postman and postman? Again, I would like to switch the perspective of machine ethics. Should the transport robot avoid certain animals or behave defensively towards them? Should it systematically exclude certain areas such as intimate zones or phases when analyzing the environment? And the third question, should it refuse to transport certain things like drugs or weapons? That transport robots refuse to transport anything is, of course, a science fiction. But in principle, to teach them ability. So I would like to come to my next example. Combat robots of diverse companies. Combat robots are involved in combat operations or are used in war, for example. Normally, they are remote controlled, but more and more, they are able to decide to act autonomously. There's so much research on this topic. They travel in the air or on the ground in the air as a drone, for example, and they are equipped with weapons or tools. From the perspective of the specific ethics, I would like to ask three questions. Is a combat robot preferable to soldiers because it does not plunder, burn, and rape? Is it preferable to your own soldiers because they are spared? What if combat robots are hacked and manipulated? That could be a problem. And again, I switch the perspective, and I would like to ask 3 questions from the perspective of machine ethics. Should the combat robot be able to deceive and cheat the enemy? Should it spare an opponent who surrendered? And should it have an artificial conscience, for example, to protect civilians next to a tourist? Sorry, not a tourist, a terrorist. And you know, there's research in the United States about these topics. And I discussed last year with my colleague Ron Orkin about the question if combat robots or robots in general should be able to deceive, if we should build, implement deceptive robots. That's a difficult question. My last example, Pepper the robot, and it's your robot on your post. I had it with me on a conference with the Daimler-Benz Stiftung. It was a conference on care robots. It's not a care robot, of course, but it's an emotional robot. It can detect emotions and it can show emotions. Pepper is an entertainment and a toy robot or a companion robot. It is often found in Japanese households, and it is also used in shopping malls. I met it last week in a shopping mall where it gives information to the consumers. Again, some questions, the last questions. From the perspective of the specific ethics, should you leave children alone with Pepper? And if so, for how long? We talked last year with Aldebaran SoftBank, and they said that Pepper is imitating, that the children are imitating Pepper in their language and in their behavior, and that could be a problem. So the second question, should Pepper's emotion recognition be used in retail to better understand customers? And last but not least, 3 questions from the perspective of machine ethics. Do you want Pepper to show some emotion even though it doesn't have one? Do you want it to speak more humanoid, to be more convincing? And the last question, should it be able to refuse to do certain things? For example, to steal from other people. That sounds funny, but that's something he might do very well. He has a beautiful hand with beautiful fingers, and I don't know, perhaps he could steal something. So my summary, probably he could steal something. My summary and my outlook, service robots are spreading more and more in closed, semi-open and open worlds. Questions arise from both information ethics as a reflection discipline and from machine ethics. In my books and articles, I answered some of these questions, but much remains to be done, and these issues must be discussed not only by science, but also by society and politics. Thank you very much. It was very difficult for me to speak because I heard my own voice, so sorry about that. I have an echo all the time, yeah. So I had to speak louder than myself. That was difficult.
So we heard you well now. I will take 2 or 3 questions on the row, and then we expect you the answer. I know there's a time limit for you, and then we will move forward. So audience, please, questions, comments. Anybody to Switzerland? Madame Delvaux.
Thank you for your presentation, and of course there are many questions, ethical questions with robots, and you mentioned some of it, and of course I would have been more interested in the answers. But my question to you is now, what would you suggest to be the procedure to come to answers? Because engineers or researchers are designing robots, and I suppose that they put these questions to themselves and that they give an answer. And in their design, there is already an answer to the question. And so what would be, in your view, the best way to answer the complicated questions? I agree that we have to involve policymakers, society, but how to involve society and how to come to a decision?
Could you hear the question?
Yeah.
No, you could. Okay,
so.
I have two more if there will be. Yes,
okay.
Please, Mr. Stramiglioli. No, I take all the questions in the row. Then you may answer.
Okay.
So the second question. Yep.
Actually, it's more a comment than a. It's more a comment than a question. To introduce myself, I'm Stefano Stramiglioli from EU Robotics, and I'm also professor of robotics and advanced robotics. There is a very unrealistic perception of what the technology can do. And a hand has been shown. Before we are able to reproduce at this stage a robotic hand, which is able to do plumbing as a human can do, as my hand can do, I will not see it. I'm 50, and if I live 100 years, I'll likely not see it. So we should be careful to be realistic about what the technology actually can achieve. Just a comment.
Thank you for that comment. And the third opportunity, please.
I don't know. Is it okay? Yeah. In your examples, there were often situations when a robot had to make a choice between making the interest of the user or having a kind of more impartial, balanced approach. Do you have an ethical answer? What is the best? What should the robot do under such conditions?
So. Now, Mr. Bendel, your answers, and I just want to add that we have been thinking in the European Parliament that at least what we have written in the EU treaties on the Charter of Fundamental Rights, such as human dignity, equality, justice, and non-discrimination, private and family life, data protection, should be there, whether it's a robot or it's a human being doing that. So that is just at least a good ground and starting point. But then we do have people and opinions that we should not regulate too much because it's too early to regulate. But there is, I think, quite clear rules that at least these fundamental rights that should support human life should be like the very clear starting point. But please, your 5-minute answer to these questions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I hope I can remember all the questions, so probably you have to help me. The first question was, what should we do? What are the next steps? And of course, we have to find answers to my questions and to all questions. And I think we should have two strategies. One strategy could be that we find solutions from information ethics and from politics, and we could define some guidelines. And of course, I know that's your work, and it's a good work what you have done in the European Parliament, a very good work. So that's the first answer. We should develop, we should define guidelines, and information ethics could help this point. The second point is that we should use robot ethics and machine ethics. And it's clear that we cannot put morality in all machines. And it's not sensible to put morality in all machines. But in some machines, we can put morality. For example, it's possible to train cars, autonomous cars, to stop for certain animals. It's a big problem and a big challenge if they should brake for people, and I can't find a solution in this point. But my research focuses on animal health and animal life, and what we could do, we could build machines that could save the life of animals. And so I would like to switch to my second answer, or to your second question. It's true, machines cannot do all what we want, and some of my explanations were a little bit science fiction, but we implemented, for example, some chatbots which are much more better than common chatbots. I think if we use autonomous machines and semi-autonomous machines, we should make them better. And machine ethics could be one way to do that. I'm absolutely sure. And we constructed the so-called good bot, and he detects problems of the user, and he can give adequate answers. And at the last point, if it has no solution anymore, he hands out an emergency number. And that's what we can do. It's a kind of ethics by design, and it's also a topic of machine ethics. The third question was, perhaps you could help me? I don't really remember.
It was what, in many cases, there is a conflict between the interest of the user and a more impartial approach. What is the advice that you would provide under such conditions?
Yes, that's a problem. And I would say for some machines, the marketplace, to say, for example, you buy a certain machine with morality, like you buy a biologic product or a fair trade product. And if this machine works in your house, in your garden, all is okay. So the machine has your morality, it's your avatar. And this machine acts in the way you would act normally, okay? But this is a rather closed world, or a semi-open world. In open worlds, it's very difficult because there are so many ideas about morality, so different approaches. And my work as a machine ethicist is to have a look to closed and semi-open spaces. That's my favorite work. And we develop solutions for areas like that. But in open worlds, it's very, very difficult. And perhaps some places in some areas we should not have certain robots. And I presented, for example, the K5. I'm not sure if we should use a K5 in our cities. I'm not sure. It is perfect for a company area, for example, but I would say we should not accept some robots in our cities, in our places, and that could be another solution from a legal point of view.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, good. Still one applause for
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And very good, we had the connection. So next, I have the honor to represent our party leader here in the S&D group, Gianni Pitella. Please welcome.
Thank you, Mia Petra. And thank you, Professor Bendel, for your statement, your presentation, and the information that you gave us. My Vice President, Josef, I would also like to thank him for the support that he has given to our I'd also like to thank our colleagues who are here, such as Madi Delvaux, who was our rapporteur on this subject and who has done an excellent job here in the Parliament. I think that this is an essential debate, an essential subject. The world is changing at a stratospheric speed, and technological innovation that can make our lives easier and make our work less tiring and make our forms of production more efficient and cleaner, understand how to manage the innovations of robotics is a priority for our group. But you need to establish well the certain relationship between democracy and technological innovation, because this relationship will determine what tomorrow's society, not society the day after tomorrow, tomorrow's society. Robotics can be used in people's interests. Therefore, we need to study what might be the consequences of robots on work, on human relations, on our daily life. We need to be the ones to establish the rules. We should not just allow robots and artificial intelligence to advance. We need to guide the process so that it's in everyone's benefit. We socialists can't say, we should never say that there is no alternative. There is an alternative. There's an alternative to neoliberalism. There's an alternative to globalization without the brakes on. There is an alternative to automation reducing labor. And that's why we're here with academics like Professor Bindel and other guest speakers who I would like to thank, who will speak either from the lectern or from the audience. We need to see how to maximize the opportunities provided by technological development. This is a difficult challenge, but it's an essential one for the democratic future. I think that this challenge could develop great opportunities, but it can also produce disastrous effects if it's not managed in an adequate way. There's an estimate that half of manual jobs could be replaced by the advent of robots. Therefore, there could be a very ambiguous or opaque impact. On the one hand, some opportunities are created, and on the other hand, jobs are lost. It's more or less what's happened with the globalization of labor, too. We've seen that the globalization, that without governance, had very detrimental effects on democracy, even on electoral trends. We need to speak frankly, and I have the habit of doing this so. The left and socialism at the worldwide level have been affected. The fact that there was the thought that globalization was a panacea for all problems, or that it produced magnificent virtues, and that the virtues produced of the market were sufficient to provide us with a better world, all that has made us neglect that we really need to engage in some self-criticism here. And there are people who have been thrown out of globalization. There are people who have lost their jobs. There have been people who have been marginalized. Think about the advance that will take place with robotics in the next 20 years and what can happen. Or whatever technological progress that takes place. We need, first, to protect jobs and the employment of people who are at risk of losing them because they have a low skill level, because their skills are not up to date. And we need to retrain these people. Otherwise, we will find ourselves with people who will be completely outside the civil society and democratic context. They will just be opposed to the system. And we have a problem of how to deal with individual freedom, how to take care of it. Robots can be useful, but they can't compress the sphere of our freedom. Otherwise, we will not be free any longer. If you can push a button and then make a plane explode, or change our travels and our choices, we're already living in a world now. Multinational corporations have an enormous monopoly on power. There are all these apps that we have on our mobile phones, myself included, obviously, and they are a limitation on our freedom. Tomorrow morning, we might see whether I'm speaking. I could be speaking, and at the same time, I could push a button on my phone, and a robot starts cooking dinner for me, or prepares my bath water. This might be something good, but also, if it's not adequately managed, it can be really a confiscation of part of our freedom. Can we assign robots to take care of people, to engage in the physical caretaking and providing medical care, helping the elderly? I don't know. I don't know whether that's something we can really do. It's an issue that we're going to have to deal with, so I'm putting it on the table in an open and critical manner to have this form part of the debate as well. Are we favorable to a tax on robots? I've read the report on the vote, and we socialists seem to be in favor of a tax on robots. A tax that will allow the recovery of financial resources that will be useful to create jobs and to retrain and requalify workers that would be otherwise removed from the labor force and labor circuits due to robotics. So this cannot be only something that will be a benefit to large multinational corporations. I don't want to stand in front of the train and saying, stop this train and stop this revolution with my hands. Because globalization can't be stopped, but it can be guided. It can be made compatible with people's human rights. That must be our commitment in this sense. So, anyone who works here in the parliament, and Mehdi and the whole socialist group, we all are in line with this position, and we will always be taking this position to support development and progress, but always with respect for people, for humans. Thank you.
Thank you, Gianni. It's very good to have these lines when we go forward in the discussion as we are thinking of the ethics, but then next we will have the topics on the employment labor market, social dimensions, what are the right skills, and even gender issues. It will be the speaker Anna Bihovskaya. Anna has been working a lot on the issue on the innovation and technological policies together with the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the OECD, as well as with the G20 together with the ITUC. And she's been also working on the policy coordinator in a CSO partnership for development effectiveness in the global perspective. So as a background, also journalist in both Paris and Berlin. Welcome, and I think the place is set to have some answers and ideas, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I would need my presentation. Okay. Sure, yeah. So I switch it myself. so I will operate the technology myself. Having said that, I agree with what has been said before already, is that this is one of the rare panels where I don't see Pepper or Sophia around to be presented as a kind of entertainment value, I would rather say. And I would agree also with the point that was made that we are far away from these robotics being effective and being diffused. But we have to also differentiate between precisely the examples that have been shown in the previous presentation and other robotics-related applications that are already being implemented in the manufacturing sector, in the service sector, so across the economy as a whole, and also pretty much in Europe already. So what I wanted to start with is related to all the aspects that I am supposed to speak about here, and I probably won't do the title of the presentation justice because this is a bit too much. And because also robotics is not only robotics, robotics is related to all the other technologies that you are probably all are talking about when it comes to digitalization. And here we have to see that, first of all, they are all interlinked. They all are being developed and designed in convergence with one another. So if there is a breakthrough, for example, on artificial intelligence, it will probably influence the implementation of robotics. The collection of data, so the so-called big data, is obviously also speeding up this process. So having said that, what we need to look at when we look for policy answers when it comes to employment policy, skills policy, is as a first step to understand the technologies that are already there, that might be there in the medium term in, say, 5 to 10 years. And those processes that, such as the robots that have been shown previously, might take much longer time to be implemented. So one needs to be very careful in the policy responses as well. Having said that, here you can see the rise of robotics being used by Amazon, so one of the big 6 digital economy companies. And this is the blue bar are the robots. The green bar are the workers working for Amazon. Now, I know this is a bit of a conflicting example using Amazon, but I'm choosing it consciously because with Amazon, what we are asking ourselves is, okay, they are introduced robots, but at the same time, they also created lots of jobs. So there is no problem there. Yet, when you look into the jobs that have been created, we see gaps in the quality of those jobs. So it is not only about how many robots are introduced, it is about what are they doing, what tasks are they replacing, and then even if jobs are created, what jobs are those? Are those non-standard forms of work? Are those part-time work, mobile work that is not under the same protections that are in existence right now at the EU level, are not being discussed within social dialogue and collective bargaining perspective? As I come from a trade union advisory committee, I'm also speaking on behalf of a social partners perspective here. So, therefore, what I want to say when it comes to employment, one needs to look at different factors in order to understand what policy responses we need. So when we look at the growth in robot intensity, which means use of robotics effectively in real economies, we see that, first of all, I don't know if you can see that, Asian countries are ahead of Europe, clearly. At the same time, these are the top 10 users of robotics. There are 4 European countries in the top 10, led by Germany, followed by France, Spain, Italy. And we see a slight rise, but not an exponential rise, such as in Asia. So when looking at that, that shows on the one hand that the change has not yet been as pronounced as we suppose. But at the same time, we also see that in other markets, the guidelines on ethics, on design, on liability, and all of that are already being set in other markets. And these are the leading developers. And it's not only in Asia, it's obviously also in the US. So one has to keep that in mind as well when talking about employment. Now, what we can also do and what we do as well is to look where are they being used then, once they're being used. And then we look at sectors. which is important for us when it comes to collective sectoral bargaining, etc. And here we see that there are huge difference between the sectors. We can see that transport, electronics is leading. The robotic use by now in 2017 is at 45% in the transport sector. It is at around 30% in electronic equipment. But in all the other sectors, it is lower than 10%, more or less on average, if not less. So again, this is also something to keep in mind, have a more sectoral approach, see what the changes, what the differences are between them. A third approach that we have taken, at least, is also to look irrespective now of technological change, because we also agree with the fact that it's not only about technological change, it's also about globalization, it's about demographics, it's about the current labor market conditions, all of that. So it's not only that we need to be guided by technology. So what we did is also to look at the job creation and decline just across occupations and sectors. But it leads us to the same conclusions that everybody has right now when talking about digitalization, when we see that there is an increase in jobs in the care sector, in the health sector, unless you believe that care robots are going to be implemented very shortly. Otherwise, there is an increase in those sectors, in managerial positions, in IT, etc. So these are all professions that are actually either complementary to digitalization or that are promoted by digitalization because you need new tasks, so you rather manage than you do manual labor. And as such, we also see a decline in certain professions that are more in manufacturing sectors, that are more in administrative tasks as well, that can be performed by computers already, etc. So this is another approach that is important to keep in mind. Now, just last point that is also important when it comes to robotics and digitalization and such is the concept that I'm sure you all already dealt with, is the concept of servicification, which means that as soon as you introduce machinery, robotics, AI in production processes, and 3D printing, which, by the way, is too costly for most SMEs, for example, so there are many constraints as well in the adaptation levels, you develop new business models that affects working conditions and job profiles, leading to a greater focus on services, on customization of products, and so therefore more work job strain, but also new roles for employees to take on because the demands are being processed faster, the business value chains across the globe are being more fragmented, and the response answer loop in customer relations is being narrowed down because the robotics can't perform the production tasks itself. So coming to the trends on the labor market, what we are trying to contest at the OECD at least is to say that technological progress is to blame on inequality levels. For example, there are 10 other reasons as to why inequality is on the rise worldwide than technological progress, but it can certainly add to it. We don't contest that. Now, in terms of policy focus, and I heard that here as well, and we don't disagree with it, but it is most of the time only skills. So we talk about automation a lot. We talk about the fact, we heard about the Oxford study of 50% of jobs in the United States being replaced in 10 to 20 years. We have other studies that are a bit more careful with this and actually are looking at tasks and come up with lower figures on job displacement. But then the only policy focus seems to be on skills, which partly is a right thing to do. But in doing so, we don't look at the framework conditions needed, at other policies, at other employment labor market policies that are much needed, at investment policies, at taxation. I know we will come to this in a moment. So the policy focus always seems to be on compensating the losers, on how to get people into new jobs. But if you assume that there will really be a vast job displacement, for which jobs are we exactly retraining those people? So there needs to be a very careful debate about promoting skills policies, but then if you do so, and that's my second point, is then how to do that effectively and how to not only say invest more into skills, which often comes as a proposal from Silicon Valley. Just yesterday, one of the main driving figures behind AI proposed a new deal on AI to publicly fund training systems, which sounds great, but it's again publicly funded training systems that are probably not up to speed with this technological change. Then there are studies like the one released by the OECD just 2 weeks, 1.5 weeks ago that looked at how artificial intelligence outperforms workers and may be able to outperform almost half of workers in 10 to 20 years. But here again, they look at figures and skills that may have measured in 2013, pair them with artificial intelligence that is not yet as developed, and come up with such results. This is not to criticize the report because there are a lot of figures and solutions in there that are of value, but the main, and this is the main what you see on the slide, this was the main message to the media. So this creates fears, but does not propose effective policy solutions. So what are the strategies? The strategies would be to, if you then talk only about skills, is to look how to create governance systems that are led by different in a multi-stakeholder way in terms of bringing both social partners, employer groups, trade unions, governments on board when it comes to designing, financing, and operationalizing those training systems. Then you have the argument that so-called high-performance workplaces produce greater productivity at the firm level, which has been proven in various studies. So if you believe in that, this can apply to any company. If it does, we can see that right now investments and financing into work-based learning are fairly low across Europe. So this is something then to look at right now, not in regards to how far we are ahead with robotics, but just in general terms, because if we need to prepare the workforce for the future of work, we need to look now how to encourage employers to invest more in training and how to also take into consideration what employees need through their workers' representatives, for example. So, and for that, you have a common ground. As I said in the beginning, you have the competition angle, because as I pointed out, robotics and digitalization are happening in a very concentrated market. It's not as much taking place in Europe as you all might know. And the SME sector is not keeping up to speed. There is obviously the interest to keep productivity by retaining so-called tacit knowledge, by investing in skills, but also to ensure that you have responsible business conduct when it comes to European companies. And here you buy, for example, if you introduce a robot that is then not really safe, for example, or you use new materials that are toxic, which relates to the whole technological convergence debate. And this has not been negotiated in between the social partners and with governments, and there are no standards. This is bad, after all, for the image of a company. So here you have examples already between leading digital economy companies actually and global trade unions that agreed on some standards and negotiations in this respect. So with that being said, my main point would be to still look at the level of diffusion per technology, but also how they work together when it comes to employment effects. But then also, from a policy point of view, to anticipate the change that is coming up still. So not say that nothing is really happening. There is a lot is happening, and a lot of which we do not understand. So in anticipating change, it is also important to talk to the technical community that are driving this, that are the ones that understand the technologies and can explain to us what the effects on jobs will be. And in this regards, really look what tasks can be automated, in what industries is this happening, what are the wage levels, what are the employment labor demographics there, how can we then adopt lifelong learning systems, finance them, etc., and then also look at the complexity of global value chains, obviously, because you cannot create framework conditions or standards if technological diffusion, but also job displacement or creation is taking place at various levels of the value chains, which is more of a global problem, but is very much related and pushed by digitalization as such. So we adopted, or we didn't adopt, but we therefore, just to end the presentation, are in favor to follow a just transition, so-called just transition approach that we are taken from the climate change debates. The just transition principles that were first pushed by trade unions were adopted in the COP21 agreement. There has been a fund has been created to support communities that are being affected by climate change. So here, and this just transition principles, they involve precisely dialogue, financing streams, etc. And obviously, this needs to be worked out effectively with different parameters. But this is something that very much applies to digitalization and robotics. Meanwhile, it is important to protect core rights, still core labor rights, core rights to social protection, etc., when it comes to jobs displacement, and also look at how to put a halt to regulatory arbitrage when it comes to the diffusion of digitalization, be it on taxation, be it on competition, or on short-term investment in this digital economy. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We agreed with the speakers here that we will have the two presentations on a row and then question answer for the rest of the time until 4:55. What is it? The 4:45. So thank you so much, Anna. And then the next speaker is Malcolm James, a senior lecturer nowadays on accounting and taxation in the Cardiff Metropolitan University, but the author of many written articles in the Journal of Tax Advisors and being also chief examiner for taxation in the Institution of Financial Services. But he has a background also in the several companies and firms on the accountants and also in industry. So on the next topic that has been touched many times, the taxation. And as mentioned also by colleague Joe in the beginning, that in the Mary's article or the paper in the House, we socialists lost that vote that taxation could be examined. And I have to say that we also lost the point that we should be actively following what would the robotization do for the working markets and jobs in Europe. So there is a fight to take in the parliament as well, as the right-wing parties didn't want to know what will happen for the working forces in Europe, which is very odd to me, because wherever you do business, it's quite interesting what happens. But let's hear Malcolm's speech, and I hope there will be something more than yes or no for taxation, because the models that we could develop is something more. Often we hear that, yes, should we then tax for the coffee machines because we want to tax robots? Or then could it be also to do something that, yes, the taxation, owning models of these robots, who could own the models? Where's the capital coming from? Is it the workers? Is it only the capital innovators, or who? So please.
Right. Good afternoon to everybody. I'm very honoured to be here. So the answer is, well, why tax robots? How do we tax robots? Could it really ever happen? I suppose are the other sort of questions everyone's sort of thinking of. So why tax robots? Couldn't resist putting that slide in. Where did this idea come from? Well, I suppose the impetus at the moment came from actually an article which Bill Gates wrote, or an interview he gave for a magazine called Quartz, which is sort of widely sort of disseminated. What Bill Gates said was that where robots take human jobs, that they should actually pay tax. Now, clearly, this begs some questions, because not least is that will robot actually take jobs? I was actually sharing a plane over from Bristol, sitting next to somebody else who's doing something elsewhere in this day on robotics, a professor in Bristol, who was saying is that this is a sort of common thing, that whenever you get new technology, people say, everyone's going to be out of work. They said that with computers. IBM, there'd be 5 IBM computers running the whole world. Of course, everyone knows that that is a complete myth, just as the idea that computers would lead to the paperless office is also sort of completely wrong. However, as Anna, the previous speaker, said, what will clearly happen is the makeup of the workforce will change. Some jobs will go, others will be created. Other types of jobs will change their nature. And I think certainly in the shorter term is that the sorts of jobs which are fairly safe are those requiring more sort of human empathy, the care professions, where it's harder to see that a robot's are taking over what humans can actually do. Now, taxing robots does actually have a certain sort of appeal. Now, as I said, it's that robots aren't going to complain about the level of tax. They don't use education and health resources. And probably also equally, given the fact that the Paradise Papers, they're most unlikely to stuff away their sort of income and assets in some sort of tax haven in the Caribbean. But then, I am being sort of slightly facetious. But I think you can't tax robots as such any more than you can tax this computer or you can tax a television set. You cannot tax an inanimate object. But what it does, it really addresses one of the key things which socialists and progressive politicians the world over should be addressing. To what extent should we raise our tax revenue? Well, to what extent should we raise tax revenue? How much of it? But to what extent should it come from capital, labour, and consumption? Now, it's no secret to anyone in this room that over the past 40 years or so, there has been a significant shift from taxing capital to taxing labour and consumption. Now, one of the countries in which that has been most marked has been my own, the UK. So in 1979, corporation tax was 52%, albeit various reliefs meant the tax base was fairly narrow. It's now 20%, and if the Tory government has its way, if it's still around much longer, is going to go down in the next few years to 17%. Meanwhile, the VAT, which was 8%, went up to 15% in 79, is now 20%. So we've seen similar shifts elsewhere. So what we would be doing by taxing robots potentially is shifting some of this burden back on to capital. Now, I say that because one of the assumptions is that capital actually economically bears the cost of profits taxes. Now, this is one of the most pervasive and pernicious arguments that we've seen over the past 35 to 40 years. There's no point taxing capital. They'll just shift it onto some combination of labour and customers. Well, I suppose the first argument here is that, okay, that's equally an argument for saying, well, why shouldn't we tax capital? Why the hell should they care? The fact that they do seem to care seems to suggest that this is not actually the case. And there was the hoax press release put out on behalf, supposedly from GE, General Electric, to say they were going to hand back a $3.2 billion tax refund as contrition for past tax abuses. And in the very short period of time between it coming out and it being exposed as a hoax, it knocked about $3.5 billion off the share price, which seems to suggest that shareholders act as though that they bear the burden of profits taxes. Now, I'm an academic, and Edward Kleinbard, who's a professor down in California, says that whenever you raise this argument at conferences, there are unseemly scuffles. Now, he obviously goes to much more interesting conferences than I do, but I think it is true, is that as academics, we sit in a room and have a good academic punch-up in the afternoon, agree to differ, and then go off to dinner and some drinks. So this is a criticism of academics, that we're a gigantic talking shop and don't actually do anything. However, Edward Kleinbard has quoted various government bodies in the States who have estimated that capital actually bears anywhere between 75% and 95% of the burden of profits taxes. These are bodies who have to make policy decisions based on their assumptions. And he said that maybe there is some merit to this idea that capital doesn't bear the burden of taxation if you're just talking about sort of normal profits. The little firm on the high street making widgets. But it really is not tenable where you've got economic rent, i.e. some sort of monopoly. And I think if we think about what is the cost of robots is going to be, most of that is going to be encapsulated in the research, in the intangibles, the intellectual property. So I think that taxing robots would be a possibility of actually capturing some of the profits which the firm is making, particularly through the sort of economic rent and the intellectual sort of property sort of behind it. How you would do it, I suppose, is very much up for grabs. At the moment, this seems to come, taxing robots, it sounds like a nice idea. No one has really given it much thought about how you would actually sort of do it. Would you actually sort of charge firms some sort of notional salary, sort of akin to what you would pay a worker for the work that the robot is doing in their place? Would it be based on some sort of capital charge? Would it be some sort of combination of the two? So I think really no one has really thought too deeply into the specifics about that, how that would happen. But I think we're looking at the moment at a sort of fairly high level. Now, one of the other things is tax avoidance. How could taxing robots potentially counteract tax avoidance. And again, it comes down to the issue of sort of the intangibles behind the costing of robots. If you make stuff like widgets, there's not an awful lot of potential for shifting your profits. The firms who really manage to shift profits to tax havens are those with large intangibles. So I suppose in a way it's not quite unlike pharmaceutical companies where the actual cost now of producing drugs might be very small, but most of the cost is recovering the research costs into developing the product. And it's a bit of, and I'll leave this maybe to the lawyers, but perhaps you could say that it's a legal convention that allows you to split off intellectual property from the underlying product and move it to some tax haven. After all, it's very much a sort of convention that allows Starbucks to actually separate its brand from the bricks and mortar of the Starbucks coffee outlets and park it in, is it Luxembourg or the Netherlands or somewhere? So it is this, so what taxing robots may be a way of trying to actually get round this, because a robot has to be physically located somewhere. And if you say, we will tax the robot in the location where it is actually physically located, which means that you cannot shift the profits or the tax charge on the robot to tax haven without shifting the underlying economic activity. And for commercial reasons, that is not going to happen, or is very unlikely to happen. Although I suppose there's always the possibility of tax competition where maybe some country which might be reasonably attractive from a commercial point of view will also cut its taxes. Maybe that's the dream of the Tory government in the UK post-Brexit, but who knows? And could it happen? This is the $64,000 question. We have to change our attitudes towards taxation. And I wrote about this back in February, March, which, given what's happened in the UK since then, seems sort of absolutely light years away. It seemed a real bit of a pipe dream then. But sort of a week is a long time, is sort of 8-9 months seems to be a positive eternity. It is actually very much back on the agenda. So it could, the fact that politically it could happen is far more likely. And the idea is that the tax raised would help to reduce inequality. And people actually talk about, would it actually discourage people from innovating, developing the robots? But then what we've seen is there's a fear of change. People would fear that robots will take away their jobs and there'll be a vast numbers of people on the employment scrap heap. And that might be a far bigger barrier. To try and allay fears, you can do one of two things. You can ban something or mandate something. That's not very popular politically. Or you can use taxation, either sort of taxing something or tax expenditure to allay people's fears. And this is why people use taxation. It's politically an easier sell to do that than the alternative. Tax may not be popular, but it's less unpopular than banning things or mandating things. So I think that those are so I think that to sum up, because I think I'm sort of probably gone over my time, no one's thought about the details. Sounds like an interesting idea. First of all, we need the political will to do it, and then we need to think about the details. I think maybe the political will is starting to be there, and we can move on to the next stage.
Yes, there are not certainly ready answers for this topic either, but a good food for thought. We do have a few minutes time for questions for the two previous speakers. Who is willing to start?
So, to be honest, I got some two. Okay.
Yep.
There is some two voice point of it if you're talking about robot, especially the first one. As an enterprise, they choose to introduce robots. So let's be honest, it's just for making some more profits and benefits. But the second voice point is as based on a worker. If every company decides to put some new robots, how should he do to find a job? Because an enterprise, if the concurrents decide to put some robots, there is some. They are going to create some. Let's see again. They're going to create some unfair competition towards workers. So, do you think it's going to be? Where is the moral about this? Because to be honest, I can find an answer of it based on some two voice points.
Other comments, questions? I'm curious to know if there is like anywhere more detailed thinking or trials or something that we could compare as the taxation on, because for me it's a taxation on robots, taxation on automatization, taxation of machines or whatever. But then I really think the taxation of capital, ownership, how to own, because and this is only a tiny blue thought what I shared with one enthusiastic robot author in Finland, that why do we not think more that if there is like 100 workers in the factory, then they buy ABB robot, then is it only the ABB owner who buys the robot? Could it be that 100 workers reduce their working hours from 40 to 35 hours a week, but they own 1% or 0.5% of that robot, and ABB owns 90%. And then the robot makes benefit or produces, as you put the capital to produce a better wins and profits. So then that would be your part of your salary. You reduce your working hours, but then you become a capitalist in the sense. I think there's very lazy thinking in the world that I do not see this kind of thinking developed enough. So if you have a comment on this one of the working capital ownership, does it need to be black and white? Could it be more developed? Any more questions? Possibility to ask these two brave speakers. Very good presentations we have.
One more here.
Okay, please, the third one.
It's just a short kind of comment. Simon Fleischmann, VDMA, German Engineering Association. We have been following this fight since the very beginning. I think it was on one of your presentation sheets, Mrs. Bienkowska, that those countries with the highest density of robots are usually also countries with very low unemployment rate. And this just shows that, I mean, I think it's also a social democratic idea to have a constantly a growth of GDP, which is also shared, everyone can participate in. And when we look in these countries which are open for technologically development, they are much, how to say, they're able to have also lower unemployment rates and have also more skilled employees with high skills. So I think at the end there is of course a question of capacity, but the solution is not kind of to, from our perspective, kind of put the burden on robotics, on automated systems by taxation or in any other way, but yeah, to find solutions how to share this wealth, which we for sure can gain from robotization. So that's just a thought.
Well, you're sort of thinking about sort of how we would actually sort of work out the sort of taxation of robots. I think your point is that thinking is not developed in this area. I think this is something Bill Gates. It's sort of been around for a while, but I think it was put on the agenda. Bill Gates did this article, and well, Bill Gates is Bill Gates. He's sort of very good at what he does, but he doesn't really hasn't really thought much about these issues, and he's sort of been flying a bit of a kite, and people have picked up on it as it may be a sort of different, because I suppose in some ways you could tax robots by it could be captured by sort of the normal profits tax, but I think it would maybe looking at different ways of taxing sort of robots in order to sort of prevent tax avoidance, and also it may only be a short-term thing, because I think one of the things is allaying the fears, because I picked up in your point particularly that countries with high density of robots have very low unemployment. If it turns out that there's absolutely no problem, then we may not actually need to tax robots for that reason. But it still might be a good idea if it stops people, is one effective way of stopping people shifting profits offshore. So there might be a number of reasons, and the idea of sort of compensating people might not actually be necessary, but there might be sort of other reasons of counteracting tax avoidance. But as I say, that it's still at a very early stage.
So on the unemployment argument of robotics adaptation and low levels of unemployment, the countries that you were referring to, Japan, Korea, China, they might have low levels of unemployment, but they have very much of a high level of precarious jobs, of non-standard forms of jobs, and of all that, and that is very well known. So I wouldn't make the connection there of robotics use and low levels of unemployment. There is no correlation in that if robots are introduced, it leads to higher levels or it maintains the same levels of employment. There is no such explanation. The low levels of unemployment in those countries are very much criticized by the OECD, by the ILO, by many, if you look at the quality of employment in those countries. So with that being said, in Europe, certainly you have an advantage in certain countries of having labor standards and maintained, let's say, and of having more stable employment markets, which doesn't mean that you need to put a burden on robotics, what you said, but, and this relates to the first question possibly, if you introduce robots, there needs to be standards in doing so. And this can be done through technical agreements at the company level when it comes to design, when it comes to introduction. If there is something like this in place, it doesn't mean that workers are displaced by robotics. It just means they have altered roles in the company or they're being sent to training, etc. And then it's fine. Then it's good that a machine is introduced that takes up certain tasks that might have been burdensome, that might have been very physical or whatever it is. So this is a good thing. But if robots are being introduced like it's being done, for instance, by Foxconn in China, a country that was shown on the slide with high robot intensity and low unemployment, certainly, they just replaced workers completely. They just introduced full robotic factories without any standards in place. and all the workers have been dismissed. Now in China you have other than methods to find something to do for those people, which wouldn't be the case here in Europe, because it's just not as managed, obviously. So there are other examples like Toyota, who did the same, who had a factory where they put robotic and machine to human operational systems in, but they decided to keep all the workers because they decided they needed them to operate the machines and to keep the managerial level going. So there are different, it's also up to the company to a certain extent to make such decisions, and up to then policymakers to impose certain standards and to, to demand responsible business conduct from such companies and to impose such standards. Very briefly on tax, because the OECD is working on that, so that's why we are following it. I'm not an expert on taxing robots, but I would say that it might be more realistic to look at taxing digital economy companies, obviously, data, which very much relates to the operation of robots and of robotics. So and discussions on intellectual property rights when it comes to inequality and the diffusion of wealth and gains from the digital economy. So I think there the solutions are much more tangible, in a sense, than to already start talking about taxing robots.
Thank you so much. My pleasure to thank you and thank for the audience on this part. We will continue.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for contributing to the discussion. We are very good in time, so we will have a very short break, and then we will have the new formation here on the podium. So 3 minutes break. So Martina, kommst du rauf?
Yeah, there will be the next speaker here. So we'll switch, and I have a meeting with the youth leaders, all the social development leaders, and then I will be back here for a short time.
Yeah.
voitures allemandes a tellement mis la pression au sein de... Tu sais, ils ont...
Um die Folien zu wechseln.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, we will continue. The second part of our conference will be chaired by Martina Werner, and the floor is yours, Martina.
Yes, thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Please let me talk in my mother language, in German. It's much more easier for me, and maybe you understand much more better what I want to say. Also beim Blick.
When I always looked at the invitations that arrived in my office, I noticed how many events there were over 3 weeks dealing with robotics. And on the 21st of November, there's going to be one with Commissioner Oettinger as the keynote speaker. So it's something that's a highly topical issue, and it's an area where the European Parliament has something to contribute. It's an area we've been confronted with. Our colleague Madi Delvaux has looked at civil law and how that can be applied to robotics and made progress there. And I'm sure that we'll be able to develop this topic and contribute more. Before I introduce our speakers and give them the floor for 10 to 15 minutes, although we don't have that much time, they will have an opportunity to speak, and then we'll have a Q&A session afterwards. But just by way of an introduction, I am deeply convinced that by developing intelligent robots, there needs to be some benefit for society, for humanity as a whole. Cyber developments and other technological advances need to be always considered from this basic perspective. Otherwise, we could be taking everything off in a very dangerous direction. Security and privacy by design need to always be included. This is something that we already need to look at in terms of research. At that stage, we should be considering the social benefit by design, not later on. It needs to start from the very beginning of the process. All different kind of applications of cyber-physical systems will require close collaboration of robots and people. They could be as colleagues at a social level or in a school with the school pupils. That's why we need to make sure that with development, users and researchers are working together. I think it's very important that stakeholders and researchers are aware of that responsibility. Another point I'd like to make is that we're assuming here a worst-case scenario where we won't, after Brexit, have the British contribution to the European Framework Research Project. That then leads us to the uncomfortable question as to can we make savings in research and development when we shouldn't be making savings anywhere in robotics? The key concepts here are intelligent cars, care robots, industrial robots that work in factories. And I'd like to know where you see the greatest industrial potential. In our new telecommunications code, our framework, we want to make sure that we have a gigabyte society by 2025, where we have efficient, modern infrastructure. That, of course, is a prerequisite for developing robotics and artificial intelligence. What kind of horizontal requirements do you think are needed if we want to have developments in these two sectors? Perhaps a lot of these questions will already be addressed in your presentations, and if not, then we can discuss them afterwards. But it was just something I wanted to leave you to think about before I introduce the speakers. We've agreed that Arno Stretgen is going to start off. He is Vice President and Head of Global Customer Service at ABB Robotics. It's a company which has been in existence for 23 years, I've been told. You started your career in Mexico, and that's where you founded ABB. It's an area that you have a deep knowledge of, and then you developed operations also in Switzerland and Spain. Also, you worked as a general manager at ABB in Spain. You have a master's in business administration from the renowned International Institute for Management Development in Lausanne. So now we know who we're dealing with. I'm very keen to hear what you have to say.
Vielen Dank für die Einladung und die
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Here today. It is a pleasure to share some of my thoughts. I'm a big believer in technology. I love technology, and as you see, I've been almost 25 years in working with robotics and different technologies. And as was said before, I think that you cannot see robotics isolated from all the other technologies that are now in the room and that we hear every day, which is big data, machine learning, so on. So everything is for sure connected, and the most benefits come if you have this ecosystem that works well together. That said, and we had also very different robots shown in the first conference, I would like to explain a little bit the space where I've been working all my life and where I will focus, because as you say today, everything is called a robot. So you can call a robot either an autonomous car or a lawnmower or automated call center. So where to make the limit, but I will focus much more on what we, let's say before, or traditional, called industrial robots that are mainly used in the manufacturing industry and that are now in many factories around the world, and hopefully try to give the impression of why is it possible to adopt more robotics in the companies today. And again, if I look at ABB is one of the leading companies in robotics in Europe, also China, and was the one developed the first robots in 1974. So the industry is quite ripe, already 40 years, but we are seeing a big shift now of growth in the latest, let's say, 5 years. If we look at the global economy, the growth compared to robotics, we see that robotics has been growing in the last years in double digit, and the estimation is that for the next 5 years continues to grow 15 to 20%. So there's a big, not only a big hype, but also something happening in the market, and we see big advances. I said before, we see that Asia is growing the fastest with 19%. This was figures from IFR, Industrial Federation of Robotics, from 2016. And Europe is not so far behind, 12%, and then, but you see a big difference in the number of units. And then we have America, which is trailing ahead in the growth, but close to the number of units. And the reasons why different countries adopt different technologies, or the pace might be different. Maybe in China, and someone mentioned Foxconn, is they're having trouble sometimes finding people and maintaining people, or when they find them to maintain, the rotation is very high. So also the rotation in some of those companies over 200%. And then training and keeping the people is very hard, and also supporting the growth. So those are one of the reasons why robotics, for example, is used in China. And then we have different reasons in different regions. If we look at the top 10 countries, we see you have 4 countries in Europe on the top 10. I think what is a little bit, I don't know, worrying, but what we have to check is that China is already 4 times the sales last year in China, were 4 times the sales in Germany. And you see, of course, the big difference in the growth percentage, where we see China growing at almost 30% in the last years. And this is not only international players like ABB that are present, and we were present since a long time in China, but also mainly a lot of Chinese competitors that have started because the Chinese government has a clear mandate to develop and in their 2025 strategy to make robotics one of their key technologies. So there's a lot of support and over 20 Chinese companies building up and gaining market share as well in China. And we know as well that one of our major competitors in Europe, a German company, was acquired recently by a Chinese company. So it's also a risk of losing the technology here in Europe. So again, if we look a little bit where the robots are used, and giving you a little bit the taste of the applications, mainly in this manufacturing industry, we see that robots are used in many different industries. But for sure, where robotics started was, or got the impetus, was in the automotive industry, basically because of large scale, very repetitive, very exact, and also very tedious jobs such as welding and so on, painting with fumes and so on. But this is changing very fast, and we see that one of the industries that are taking this stronger is the electronics, and that's why also China is gaining such a big jump, because of course they are the main producers, not only China, but also Vietnam, Korea, and so on, and Asia are the main producers of what we all use today, mobile phones. So maybe it's also interesting to look at it in a perspective when we talk about, let's say, I talk now only about industrial robotics. Industrial robotics, as I said, they're growing very fast, but still it's only was 300,000 industrial robots sold last year, compared to 90 million cars, compared to 500 million PCs, compared to 2 billion phones last year. So if you put it in relation, the robotics is still very young, and also the density, as was said before, it's less than 100 robots per 10,000 workers. So I think robotics has been mainly used, and I still believe that's the main purpose in jobs that are first very repetitive, also dangerous environments, and take away some of the tedious jobs. So if we look at the applications, what robots do inside of these factories, the biggest applications are actually material handling. So basically moving a part from one stage to another, machine tending, putting some parts into machines. The other biggest, and maybe that's due to automotive industry, is welding. So welding is the second biggest application. And then we have some kind of assembly where you need very fine, sometimes very exact movements or very fragile parts to be moved. So those are the main, to give you an idea, where are the main applications in the robotics today. If we look at why is the robotics growing so much in the last years, and I mean, there are many trends. Some are very old and some are new that are fueling this growth. And one, I think, was said also before, is this: the low volume, high mix becomes a new normal. That means that we're all used to always getting more customers that we want to buy the phone with our own color, with our name engraved on it. So customization, when before it was more about large scale, now customization becomes something we all expect, and also delivering. By that, you need much more flexibility. So flexibility is one of the drivers, because robots can be reprogrammed to do one task and then another task, and maybe take different variants, even compared to the automation that we have before, which was, let's say, fixed automation. Of course, the high cost of downtime is always the fight for productivity, and in highly intensive capital factories, Of course, one in the automotive industries. I normally hear the word when one of our robots stands still, they threaten us to say, well, 1 minute downtime in automotive factories probably costs like 20,000 euros. So, and there might be different figures playing around, but still the cost of downtime is very high, and that is playing in there. And then, of course, the rising labor costs and talent shortages that we see in a lot of industries. If we look a little bit more in detail then, for example, in economy of scales, I think I mentioned it, mass customization is coming everywhere. We like to be able to configure the products in the internet by a click of the button, get it next day to our door, and this is felt that you need much more flexibility in your production, and robotics is one way to actually adapt to these trends. The other is the demographic change, and sometimes, again, we talk about job loss, but when I talk a lot to our customers, and can be in Germany and other, they have a worry. A lot of, in the next 10 years, about 20% of population are getting into retirement. And a lot of people say, well, yeah, but they're welcoming newcomers. What my experience is that it is hard to find people in the new economy, what we call millennials. They're so used to work with the digital, with creative jobs, that it's hard that they have interest to work in manufacturing repetitive jobs. So a lot of companies are actually worried on how to actually cover that gap in the following 10 years. More than that, of course, as said before, is all the jobs that are dangerous, that are not healthy for the human self, in environments that are very repetitive. If we look then at also a new trend, and I think that was mentioned before, is that the big objective is, of course, to make this technology available in the smaller manufacturing, the smaller companies. Until today, I think, or the past, was that most of the robotics was deployed in larger companies and could be in the manufacturing, automotive or larger manufacturing companies. But this is changing very fast, and we see always more robots deployed in a small scale, helping small manufacturers also to compete in a large scale, in a large economy. Another trend that's worthwhile to mention is when we talk about also the labor, and is that, for example, if we look at US and also in Europe, a lot of companies are doing what is called reshoring. A lot of companies left Europe and the US because of labor cost and sent it to countries with lower labor cost. But now, much time, the logistics cost, the speed to markets is much more important. And with automation, those factories can be brought back also into Europe, protecting actually the labor. The key here is that robotics, of course, makes the companies more productive, and they're more competitive. And normally, if you see a correlation, and I think someone mentioned the correlation between the unemployment, which is maybe on a very big scale, and you cannot correlate directly that there's a direct link between number of robots and low unemployment. But we do see a lot of cases where, if you look at industries that are using robots, they are at the same time creating more jobs. For example, in the automotive industry, in the last 7 years, we said that they have the installed base of robots has increased by 50,000 robots, but the people employed were 260,000 robots. Additional people employed were 260,000 robots. So it does not mean that when you put in a robot, you automatically replace. You find also other jobs for people working more with the programming, with the sequencing, with the data analytics. And I think that's the main message, that we have to work on the skills to also transform and have more skills to deal with the digital economy, where it's robotics or big data or just computer. And when the computer was introduced many years ago, I mean, there were also a lot of jobs today that didn't exist at that time. So if we look at what we need to address to actually make robotics available, and this is one of the objectives of ABB Robotics, make available for small manufacturing industries, actually simplification, collaboration, and what we call digitalization. Simplification, making it very easy to use for anybody. Collaboration is that robots are not in the cages anymore, that they are safe to work together with humans, and then digitalization, you have heard a lot about Industry 4.0. So maybe to finalize, why is this changing also is because the technology and the sensors that make robots more, let's say, aware and adaptive to the change is that are becoming less expensive and are being used in our cell phones. Our cell phones have more than 7 sensors. You have accelerometers, you have cameras that before cost a lot of money and today are available there so to give robots vision and senses and so on. So as my final slide, just to conclude, I would say that if we look at the factory of future, I think digitalization and collaborative robot will be the main part of these factories if you want to maintain competitive. I think that robotics will use this, all the sensors will give additional information, but I don't see, as my last word, machine learning in extreme that robots will take decisions or will just take over the process. I see, for example, and with this example I want to finish, is that, for example, today to program a robot to grab different parts that you might want to buy on Amazon, there are thousands of different parts. You can buy a teddy bear, you can buy a book, but to grab one is very complicated. So now today we program how to grab this, but if you have thousands of objects, you cannot program them. It would take too much time. Together with vision and learning algorithms, you could actually have that benefit that the robot with time learns how to grab those objects better. And that is, let's say, a real example of how we could use machine learning, but not for robots to take decisions. I think the cognitive work, rewarding jobs, the creative and technical decisions will always stay with the humans. Thank you.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much, Mr. Strötgen. I think you've given us a deep insight into how companies think, especially companies that sell robots. And that was really interesting. Thank you very much. Now I can move on to our second speaker, Stefano Stramigioli, professor at the University of Twente and involved in the Association for EU Robotics. You lead the platform in the Netherlands and you lead the robotics and mechatronics group at the University of Twente. You have a Master of Science and a professorship. Since the 1990s, you've been a faculty member at the University of Twente, and you're a member of the Intelligence Service Robotics Board. The floor is yours.
So, I think it was introduced, I have a number of hats. And one hat is about the robotics position as vice president. The other one is about a nerd. A robotics is a professor of this technology. And I couldn't leave it out to first talk about that before actually talking about robotics. And I would like to express my appreciation about the discussions, which I found extremely useful. And also, as I said to the previous two speakers, I think that it's very important to put things under perspective. So let me start with a citation of a colleague, which was actually, this citation was done in 1988, and this is still very, very true. So it is very easy for machines, and then you should think about AI kind of computations, to play chess or play Go and these kind of things. But it's still extremely hard for machines to do things that a little baby can do. So the combination of AI and robotics is absolutely overestimated in the media. And as was also pointed out, the manipulation as the hand, as I say in one of my comments, we are far from being able to do a lot of things that people think that are coming up. Another thing I would like to mention with my head of roboticists is a relation between AI, robotics, Asimov, and engineering. It's a sentence I just figured out while I was following the previous speaker. Another very important thing about AI, we cannot leave decisions to AI which have consequences in safety, moral, and legal implications. But yet we can thanks to technology, there are methods which I will not go into, which we have to develop. And why do I cite Asimov? Because it is in our hands what we do. And we can, by legislation, enforce that these technologies are put in. So we can use AI with the safety, legal implications. And another thing is more a very, very personal perspective about the development of robotics. I always say about this discussion, I think that evolution will be in two phases. The first phase, which is actually we're entering right now, it's far from a lot of people think. There will be no loss of jobs, there will be a lot of shifts of jobs, and technology, we cannot just stop technology, it's coming. So we have just to do better than the others because things are coming up. And there will be no lot of jobs. But in the future, am I talking about maybe, I'm speculating, 50 years, I will be dead by then, for sure. There will be humanoids going around do everything for us. But then things will not be a problem of technology, will be a problem of how economic flows is going, legislation, social security, and all these things. And the step is not incremental, it's disruptive. So we need to think completely different, and not just to put adaptation like taxes. We have to rethink the complete economic flow, because the whole idea of, for example, marginal cost economics, it's gone. Okay, so these are just some comments I would be more than pleased to talk about during the coffee. Now I would put up my head as EU Robotics. EU Robotics is an association which represents robotics in Europe, is the private side of Spark, which is the collaboration with the Commission, which was mentioned before in the beginning. We have about 250 members, and it is actually together with the Commission we have set up the biggest robotics civil problem in the world. The management is done, we have a president, and I have the pleasure to lead as Vice President of Research, the research side, and the industry side is led by, of course, by somebody from industry. Robots are obviously everywhere. We are here, that's why we're talking about it, and I was this morning in another session, and there is something else going in the Netherlands today. Robotics is very hot, not for nothing, because it is going to change the way we work, we live, and we operate. The world market is rapidly changing, and the growth is, as it was said before, I'm going pretty quick so that we'll have some time for space for discussions, is in double digits. Indeed, China, as was also mentioned before, is growing very, very fast. But do not forget that a lot of the technology and the wealth which has been generated, is going to be generated worldwide, is thanks to European innovation. The driving cars was mentioned before. Well, one of the leaders of the Google project that brought Google where they are is Sebastian Thrun, which is, a German guy who's been in the community, robotics community, for a long time. So we in Europe, we have been leading this for a long time. We are still leading, and we should prevent that somebody else take the lead. So it's very important that we are very active in communicating about it. The market has been mentioned before. I think it's very important to think, of course, as people here are aware, not only the industrial robotics, but the service robotics, which is booming. I mentioned the other session, another very project that I'm involved myself. We had a spin-off in our lab, you may have seen, is this robotic bird that can basically scare other birds at airports. And it's unique in the world, it is European. And have you ever thought that you would have a robotic bird preventing? No, this is really new innovation that robotics is bringing to us. The market is divided in various sectors, and we're trying with the EU Robotics and together with the Commission to shape it and keep the leadership in it. And of course you have to think, when you think about robotics, not only about the robots. There are the technologies that can be used from other fields or can deploy to other fields. There are the robot itself, the object we actually develop, and the services that get around it, because of course with robots and machines there will be new services that will take place. And one thing that I was mentioning before, that was mentioned by one of the previous speakers, also these services, the big Googles of our time, it's exactly the issue. How do they generate the wealth that they have just by using information? Okay, and these services, once you have it there, they generate data and information. So we have to think it in a complete global context. We have a lot of members, 250 members at this stage. We still are growing and hope to grow. And it's a very nice collaboration between industry and research. The way this Spark actually was born is a cooperation between the Commission and EU Robotics, which is the private side. And the history that has started many years ago actually in FP5 with the setting up of an academic network, Euro 1, then Euro 2 came to be, And the industry started and created another association, which actually unified industries, academics, and from industry. And we actually really shape the ecosystem. So we organize a forum, a year forum, which we want actually to strengthen now. We have events on the Robotic Week, which I think is next week or the week after. And we have competitions and a brokerage day to match academic to industry. We advise the commissions on how to go, and the communication has been very fruitful, very pleasant, and very productive. We have a lot of topic groups of different kind, and not only technical, but also handling ethics, for example. And we extend and we sunset groups depending on the evolution of the field itself. We have identified the way to work by looking at what actually is needed from the various domains that I mentioned before, and what actually technology has to offer in order to create ability for the technology. And as said before, we have generated the strategic research agenda and the multi-annual roadmap. This is more about the big challenges, perception, cognition, mechatronics, and I don't understand, it's a bit smaller, so you probably cannot see because the slides are pretty big. We started now something that we call the lighthouses. And the lighthouses, we identified 4 fields, which actually also the Commission is going to put efforts in that. Agile manufacturing, inspection and maintenance, agri-food and healthcare. And these are 2 main fields where I think we can lead in Europe, in the world. And actually we will start and connect these lighthouses as being a global efforts together with efforts that the Commission is starting in the digital agenda, like pilots and digital innovation hubs. And we are starting now specifically with the health care lighthouse, and we will follow with the other. As I said, we are going behind technology. We are looking also standardization, ethical issues, legislations, and all the things, because robotics is very special in that respect, and that is why actually we are here to discuss about the implications that robotics has. It's different than other technologies. Closing, getting to a conclusion, we have a very strong community that links academia and industry, and we work behind technology, as I said just now, and we really try to have a public outreach. I think that the image of robotics in the media is absolutely wrong. You know, I get very irritated sometimes when you see certain programs on the media that give a completely wrong image of what robotics can do, and as a consequence of that, people get scared. And so actually at the international level, I'm involved in the governmental forum of IEEE, which is the biggest technical society in the world. And we want to take big actions to make a big public, how do you say, action in order to really let the public opinion understand what robotics is all about. What next? Well, connecting the citizens by doing this kind of actions, building on the success we had and maximizing the impact. We have an opportunity here, we have not a threat, and we should, as a European community, do our best in order to match everything and all the ingredients which are necessary, which is not only technology, but it is also policies, ethical issues, and certainly legislation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ja, vielen Dank, Herr Stramijoli.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stramijoli. Thank you for that very committed presentation. I think there will be a lot of questions on that, and we can move on to our next speaker, Stefan Miklitz. He is the engineering director on the Identity, Privacy and Security team at Google in Munich. His team focuses on providing users with tools and controls to manage their privacy and security. Since 2007, he has been working as a software engineer, and since 2009, he has been part of the team which he now leads. He has a master's degree in computing science from the Technical University in Munich, and before he worked in Google, he worked with other software companies. Thank you.
I'm going to do my presentation in English. Thank you for the introduction. As you said, I have a team in Munich that works on transparency and control, user trust, My team is composed not only of engineers, I'm an engineer, but we work across the spectrum from user research to design, product, and implementation. And my team is responsible at Google for all the tools that we build for our users that help them understand what happens and that put them in control of their data. So I'm going to take us away a little bit from the robots towards data and towards how we put our users in control and what transparency and control means in a technology landscape which is evolving. So first I want to start off with setting the context, right? Google is much more than just search. When people talk about Google, they often talk about search, but there's a number of other projects. And what my team is responsible for and what we are thinking about is how do we, for all of these different projects, for all of these different surfaces, and there is more to come, right? How do we provide our users with effective mechanisms to understand what's happening and to be in control? We have already heard, right? Data is important. Data drives a lot of the services that we provide that are provided by robots. So it's important that we talk a little bit about what we need to do here. And what we need to do here is we need to keep data private, we need to keep it safe, and we need to make sure that our users are always in control. Data improves services, right? And a good example, I think, for how data improves services is Google Maps. You use Google Maps all the time, hopefully, and then if you use it, it helps you to get to the places you need to get to faster. And it does that by providing you a routing that is the best at the given time, right? How is that done? There is data, obviously, in the background, where, like on aggregate, we know there's a traffic jam, and we know how to route you so that you get to work faster, right? And there's a couple of more examples on the slide, how data is useful, how data helps to provide more and more services. I want to come to an aspect where it's less thought about when it comes to use of data. But if we think about security and security of our systems, then data is essential to actually help us stop attacks to our systems. As a big service provider, we have many, many such attacks. It's not exaggerated, right? We have hundreds of billions of attacks every week against our systems that try to get into our systems, that try to get access to data they shouldn't have access to. And it's our job to stop them. So we have a big and dedicated team that works on this. Here's a list of things where the team works on, and fighting all of these things. Data is essential, but also technology advances such as machine learning are essential to actually stay ahead and to be able to keep the data that we have secure and safe. Specifically, I want to talk a little bit about spam. If you have ever used our email service, you see that there's almost no spam in your inbox. Very rarely you have a spam email that makes it through to your inbox. Why is that? There's a lot of work going on in the background, which you hopefully never see, and that's around detecting spam emails. Machine learning is used in that context a lot, and that has been used for many, many years in that context. That's like a 10-year-old technology, right? It's not something that just happened, but there's advances in machine learning that help us stay ahead of the curve, right? You see different types of machine learning classifiers that make up most of the thing that are pretty established, but then there's this new part around deep learning where we actually manage to stay ahead of the curve when it comes to detection of spam email, for example. And then there's also a little bit of a deterministic element, just very simple rule-based systems, right? So if you look at that, then you see data is important, technology advances are important to keep our users safe. Let's switch to the privacy aspect of things, right? What is our privacy program about, and how is that related to technological advances, and does that still hold when we talk about technological advances? One of our basic principles at the company has always been focused on the user, and everything else will follow. So putting the user in control is the most important aspect of our work. And we have commitments. We have made commitments to privacy and security And these commitments are pretty universal. And if you look through them, you actually see that these commitments stand regardless of which technology you talk about, right? We want our users to understand what data is collected. We want our users to understand how data is used. We want them to have effective controls to manage what they want to do. And that's a very personal decision. Security is important, and it gains importance as we see more and more of the technological advances and more devices coming into our lives. Security is essential. So security needs to come first. It's the baseline that we need to get right. We do never sell personal information to anyone. We want to not generally improve our services, but we want to help making the internet a safer place. As an example, I'm a member of the board in Germany called Deutschland sicher im Netz. That's a non-profit organization that cares about how do people how are people safe online, and how do we help people to understand what's happened and to be more safe online. The privacy program at Google is big. My team in Munich is around 80 people, but overall we have more than 300 people working full-time in majority in technical roles on putting our users in control and helping our users understand what we do. And when we go one step further from the principles that I've outlined, these four basic sets of work items are the one which we are working on: choice, transparency, control, security. And if you look at these four items, there's nothing in there that suggests that with the advancements in any type of technology, may it be machine learning, robotics, the combination of everything, that we cannot uphold these principles. And that's the work that we are set out to do. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Okay.
Yeah, here.
Where? Ah, yes, over there.
Does it work? Yeah. Hi, I would have a question for Mr. Stramijoli, because you mentioned that the picture that the media it's let's say selling about robotics, it's wrong. So I would be curious to know which messages would you give to the general public regarding robotics, and more specific on the you said that you were already working on this to give a better image of what robotic is. What are you planning to do to switch this public opinion concerning robotics? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. I will give you an example. I think that probably helps. I'm regularly contacted by media if there's something going on in the Netherlands. And for example, there was something that's in the US, somebody has built a robotic hand. That's why I talked about it as a typical example. And they were saying, something like the media was like, we reproduced the human hand. And first I started laughing, and then I said, we need some time that I can explain what to do, because people use this because it's sensational. We reproduce the robotic hand. But the consequence where somebody doesn't have a technological background thinks that the human hand has been reproduced. And what can you do with the human hands? Everything. Most of the cortex is actually steering the hand. And we are far from that. AI can, for example, do a lot of things. And people think that, everything is possible. But there's a big difference between crunching data, where AI is extremely successful, and using that technology in order to use perception and motion. And that is the wrong message. So we are not going to see humanoids walking around and doing jobs for us in the coming 50 years, as I said. What we want to do is try to build up this message in a proper way by letting scientists and engineers talk about it, creating a good message, and then creating, for example, a documentary with the BBC, a good quality, high quality program broadcasting company, for example, and trying to convey that message. So the truth, basically, of what can be done now, and not just fantasies that people think that don't make the difference between what is truth and what can be done and the fantasies.
Then thank you very much That was really interesting, and I'm sure that people do have other questions, but we have a limited time frame and we need to move on to the next panel. So thank you very much for taking part and giving us that insight into the issues. Thank you.
The last round, thank you very much, Martina, and the panel. And we're coming to the last round. Madi Delvaux will chair. And as it looks now, we are very, very, very good in time. So I hope you can.
I think we are short in time, but
you can continue like this. So thank you. The floor is yours.
Our third panel. After listening to industry, which was very interesting to know what is possible in robotics and where is the success, we come to the third panel, which is very vast. It's access to data, privacy, cybersecurity, regulatory framework, liability. So I don't think we can cover all the topics with our three speakers. The only thing I wanted to add that is I believe that if we want our industry to be successful and we want European industry to remain successful, we must not over-regulate, but there are some applications where I believe that we need some regulation because investors and industry need also certainty, and so do the consumers. But I will not make the conclusions before the debate. So our first speaker is Giovanni Sartor. He is a part-time professor in legal informatics at the University of Bologna and part-time professor in legal informatics at the European University Institute of Florence. He has a PhD at the European University Institute, and he worked at the Court of Justice of the European Union in Luxembourg. He was a researcher at the Italian National Council of Research. He held a chair in jurisprudence at Queen's University of Belfast. He was Marie Curie professor at the European University of Florence. I don't know if I have all your titles. It's very, very, very impressive. You were also president of the International Association for Artificial Intelligence Law. I stop here and we will listen to you.
Microphone for the speaker, please.
Mike, please.
Sorry. I will present some legal issues pertaining to robots. I will shortly discuss robot law, what it means, what are these issues, and then focus a bit on autonomous robots. I appreciated very much the reality check that came, especially for the last speaker, but I will make also some futuristic hypotheses, just to anticipate future issues. So, as we all know, AI is booming, and the same for robotics, as we learned from the last presentations. And AI is moving on, and even though I much appreciated the cautious comments that we had previously, indeed, many things that computer could not do only a few years ago now have become doable, from translating to generating and understanding speech, to guiding autonomous cars, playing ping pong, and so on and so on. As we all know, there has been a very important document, a resolution adopted by the European Parliament February 2017 on civil law rules of robotics, and there you can find a characterization of what smart robots are, focusing on autonomy in getting input data and affecting the environment, self-learning, physical support, adaptation, and finally, obviously, non-biological entities. And some very interesting and shareable, I would say, suggestions on robot liability. So the idea of having compulsory insurance schemes to cover damages, maybe set up a compensation fund, general one, having limiting the liability of developers, deployers, users of robots, having a cap possibly, not limiting the kind of damages, but rather the amount to be paid, having a general fund, registration number so that identification is possible, and a connection to the fund, to the users is also possible. And finally, some more futuristic perspective on electronic personality for robots. Another important document where robots meet the law, I think, is the General Data Protection Regulation, which includes no explicit reference to robots, but a number of interesting issues emerge that we will have to address in the next, very soon, I think, in the next years. So, do robots, for instance, when a robot has a camera and it faces a person, is a processing of personal data taking place? And then secondly, who is the controller? Who is defining the purpose and the means of this processing? Is the user, the deployer of the robot, or is it, to some extent, one may argue, the robot itself, to the extent that the robot is making such determinations, or if it is the user, to what extent his processing extends given the autonomy of the robot. And then the issue of privacy on security by design and by default, which is one of the core novelty provided by the GDPR. How do they apply to robots? What architecture and constraints are needed for robots to respect privacy and data protection? How to embed such ideas in the engineering of robots? How to maintain security, which is also a very challenging task, data security with regard to data being processed by robots. And then there is also the issue of decision-making by robots. There is, in the GDPR, there is a right not to be subject to solely automated decision, which would also apply to choices being made by a robot, maybe even elementary choices, whether to make or not to make a contract, whether to allow or not to allow somebody to enter a facility, and so on. And there are many exceptions, broad exceptions to this right, but still there is the right to the obligation for controllers of decision-making devices to safeguard legitimate interest of the data subject, and also to provide information on why certain choices have been made. How to translate this kind of requirement into robots, I think, is going to be a challenging, very challenging task. But let me say something more general about the law of robots. Why there has been a discussion on why robots are different. There has been a vast debate on ICT law in the last years. do we need to some laws specifically addressing robots? What is the difference between robots and the internet, or maybe AI applications over the internet? So it is said that robots have embodiment, they can cause physical harm, emergence, they may perform behavior, the possibility of which was not anticipated, and then they may be taken by humans as partners. And there is a discussion on whether these features are really relevant. Another feature which is addressed is intelligence and autonomy as related to intelligence. This raises a second issue that is connected to the presentation that we had earlier on machine ethics. Machine ethics is the idea that you may have, to some extent, moral machines that are able to behave morally towards people, or maybe also towards other machines, if their machines are seen also as moral entities. So we may wonder, what are the addressees of robot laws? Are humans developers, those making robots, programming them, training them possibly, those deploying them, or even the end users of robots? Or maybe the robots themselves. This raises science fiction issues, but maybe we can also imagine that robots, not really imagine, but robots will have to comply the law. For instance, an autonomous car will have to comply with traffic regulation. So the idea that robots may have to comply with law, that then we have to engage in explicit law by design that is providing robots with the capacity to comply with norms, is not so far-fetched into the future. What is the specific of robot law? I think that when we speak of autonomous robots, we may consider that they have the capacity to make certain factual assessment and then making decisions on what to do under these conditions. An autonomous car must have an awareness of what is happening on the street and make choices on what to do, what to avoid, what path to take under such conditions. And robot law should indeed address the fact that some degree of autonomy may have, that robots may have some degree of autonomy, and also capturing the connection between who deploys a robot and including also who designs and uses the robot. This relation should be addressed to some extent by robot law in order to allocate liabilities and legal changes consequent to the use of robots. I go quickly over these slides. Obviously, some robots are non-autonomous. Then we have various robots exhibiting some limited degree of autonomy, and then we have the science fiction perspective we got used to through movies, and that maybe will become actual in a few decades, as we heard. And autonomous weapons is a domain where robotic autonomy is being already deployed. What shall I say about autonomy? Not much, but it is, I view it as a scalable capacity, merging at least 3 dimensions. So the capacity to operate independence meant as the capacity to operate in a real-world environment without any external control. This is from Becky. Capacity to learn to some extent, to compensate for partial or incorrect prior knowledge, and then also to have a kind of internal cognitive architecture, capacity to perceive the environment and to react to it on the basis also of the internal states of the robot itself. We may wonder to what extent existing robots exhibit this kind of features. I go quickly over the characterization of autonomy, since I want to have little time and I want to focus more on the legal issues. So autonomy in cognition, capacity to adapt, to learn from the environment. And then also, in certain cases, I think we can also have systems that are able to track certain aspects of the environment, have objectives, select actions, and maybe also obey to constraints of requirement over their objectives and plans. And okay, you can imagine, for instance, this kind of dialogue taking place with an autonomous vehicles, and you see that we can indeed ascribe to the vehicle attitudes of various kinds on the basis of which we explain the vehicle's behavior. So I think that we should view the relation between the user or the deployer of a robot and the robot itself also in legal terms as a kind of delegation through which somebody assigns a task to the robot, does not pre-select the determination that the robot will have to do in order to achieve that task. For instance, a car, you order give the mission to reach a destination, you don't pre-select all the choices that are going to be done to get to that destination. And so the failure to anticipate the details of those choices is no real limitation, but is rather a feature of the use of autonomous systems. Let me go now to see what is the legal implications of what I have been saying so far. Even without personality, robots can do a lot of activity that is meaningful for the law. Obviously, they cannot have rights and duties on their own. They cannot perform actions affecting their own rights and duties. For instance, they cannot have liabilities, and they cannot make contracts for themselves. But still, they can perform actions that trigger legal effect upon their deployers, liabilities in particular, make contracts also, when so delegated. And we may wonder whether we really need robots with legal personality. Let me go quickly, now I have too many slides, about particular kinds of liabilities that robots may have. There may be, can there be criminal conduct by a robot? Yes, why not? A robot conduct could be a crime in case if it were accomplished by a person. So a robot may be directed to commit a criminal action, such as killing a person, destroy a facility where humans are present. For instance, we can imagine easily that an armed robot may exercise lethal force to an intruder exactly for the purpose of stopping the intruder itself. Or we may have a case when a robot engages in a behavior we would be negligent if done by humans. What shall we say under this kind of conditions? I think that can there be what is said, what is called a liability gap? That is, the robot engages in a behavior that would be criminal if it were done by human, but no human is criminally liable. In principle, I think yes, but we should consider that robots should be allowed only when they provide social benefit on balance, the civil remedies are applicable, and then a user may be criminally liable for recklessness or negligence for deploying a robot when criminal conduct was foreseeable. But there are issues on the military, and I think also in the security domain. What about torts? Can robots engage in activity that will count as a tort if done by humans? Again, I say yes. There can be a negligent deployment of a robot that will generate liability for human, or the negligent choice to deploy a robot for an unsuitable task, or the negligent choice even not to employ a robot. For instance, in certain medical domains, a certain level of performance can only be achieved by using medical robots. Or the negligent choice not to integrate robots and humans when the combination of the two skills would be needed to achieve the required level of performance, such as, I think, in certain cases in the medical domain. I go quickly over it. Various remedies, various methods have been proposed to deal with liability for the activity of the robots, strict liability, product liability. Is there a liability gap? I think that there may be a liability gap in certain cases where we would have liability by fault by humans and the robot causes the harm. But these cases are limited, and the Parliament gave us a good advice in their resolution. The last case, but I will not have time to comment on that, is that whether robots can engage in contracts or can make meaningful legal acts. You can see the example that deals with a robotic contract. Is this possible? I would say yes. The principle, the human principle, exercises its autonomy by delegating the formation of the contract to the robot, and indeed, it may be the robot who decides to make that particular contract. And has the relevant situational awareness. But still, the effect of the contracts will fall upon the humans. Are there problems? Yes, I think we need to rethink a certain kind of issues, such as imbalance in contracts, because robots may have certain kind of superhuman capacities, as well as some subhuman capacities. And the assessment of the contract may depend on what party succeeded in exploiting the other parties. I think I'm exceeding my time, so I will stop, saying that we are entering this new era where robots are going to interact with us and with other intelligent automata, and the law needs to adapt to that. The time has come, I think, to take initiative, and I would like to thank the Parliament for moving the debate from theory to policy making. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sartor. I'm sorry that we are short in time because the issues are very complicated and we certainly need further debates, but I will, without any further intervention, invite Michaela Köller to take the floor. She is Director General of Insurance Europe and Secretary of the Global Federation of Insurance Associations. You worked in Brussels for 25 years, but not only in insurance. You were also in pensions, but I will save time, and but you are a very important partner if we want to deploy, for instance, autonomous cars on our roads. And we have we need a partner like insurance. So we will listen to you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us. I think it's a very interesting topic, and my starting point would be that when we talk about robotics, and I thought really this afternoon showed that very clearly, we talk about a lot of different things. And we have a number of very different examples seen already in the presentations this afternoon. Autonomous vehicles, drones, smart homes. So there is a vast variety. When you look at it from an insurance perspective, what we want to make sure is that everyone is protected. And we look at it, in fact, from two perspectives. The first perspective is an insurer covering a consumer. And a consumer could be, for example, the owner of a device, the owner of a drone, and how can we cover him or her? Or we look at it from the perspective of an insurer covering a manufacturer that puts in place a certain new technology, and now this technology, as we have just heard, can react in various ways. Now, if we want to make these new technologies insurable, we need a number of preconditions that need to be met. And I think it's very typical for insurers to look first at prevention of loss and therefore at safety. And for us, a very clear starting point is that we need to make sure that we have safe products in the market. And I come to that maybe also later on a little bit more in detail. The second point that we need to look at is, do we have relative certainty about the cause of the defects? For example, when we talk about new technologies, there are a number of possibilities that we need to consider. Is the defect in the hardware? Is the defect in the software? Is the defect maybe appearing because the owner of the hardware software was negligent in terms of updating software? Is the defect a result of a hack? And depending on where you come from and how this defect have actually materialized, the liability situation can be vastly different. And then in the end, what we also need from an insurance perspective, and that is a bit in opposite to my to the speaker beforehand, is we need a relatively stable legal environment, because we need to develop these products now, and if we are confronted with a vastly changing legal environment, it will be harder for insurers to put things in place. We also need to look at what will happen when these conditions are not met. And maybe it is also important to note that insurance is a highly regulated industry. We are subject to prudential rules, Solvency II. So if we are operating or providing cover for in an insecure environment, it means we are exposed to higher risks. We have to pay capital for these higher risks, and that obviously has an impact on insurability and pricing of these risks. So that is something that we need to bear in mind. So what can we do to increase insurability? So we need to to focus on safety by design when we really put these products in the market. We need to have in-depth research about the sources of the defects and no hasty changes in the legal environment. And now maybe to illustrate the point, I want to go to a couple of examples. Autonomous vehicles, you mentioned that. So what will happen? Right now we have compulsory third-party motor insurance. And what it does is it essentially makes sure that when an accident happens, then the victim of this accident is always compensated. Now, when we move now to higher degrees of automation, connectivity, what will happen is, and that is, by the way, based on the Motor Insurance Directive. So when we move to these higher levels of autonomous vehicles, the Motor Insurance Directive will continue to remain in place. It will still make sure that we compensate every victim of a road traffic accident, independent of the cause. But what will happen is that we can seek recourse from the manufacturer who has put this vehicle or the technology on the market. So it's not something that the victim of the accident will see, but that will take place basically behind the scenes. Now, when you look at other technologies, again, we are confronted with vastly different situations. You have autonomous lawnmowers, you have drones, you have robots that are, for example, performing surgery. And when you look at these things, they also present vastly different risks. The risk when you have a lawnmower is maybe more limited than the risk that you have when you put a drone into traffic. You can think about insuring just the loss of the drone. You can move to insuring the loss of a building when a drone crashes into any public building. But think about what happens when a drone crashes into a plane and, you know, the disastrous effect that could have. Obviously, the damage vastly different, and therefore insurability of these kind of risks vastly different. Same when you look at surgery, when you have robots that perform surgery, again, very different risks. So when we talk about advanced technology, I want to go back to my safe by design approach. When you look at the current situation, presently, I must say I was very surprised, and I couldn't quite believe that this is the case, but when you look even at the current situation, we have now products on the market that are not fulfilling European standards in terms of product safety and design. The General Product Safety Directive, the Machinery Directive, are not always applied by the products that are already now in the market. So what we think... Could you give an example? Well, that we have, for example, toys in the market that are, come in from different parts of the world. And when you have a child looking at it, the color can come off. That is clearly not adhering to safety standards that we have established in the European Union, but they circulate. And we know that when you look at the insured cases, that these are often and frequently then the cases where defects happen and where cases appear that then provide or trigger basically the need for compensation. So when we go to new technologies, obviously we need to make very sure that these new technologies that come in are subject to our safety standards. We have ENISA, the new cyber security body, that will develop now ICT certification. We have also the European Commission's Joint Research Center that is looking to develop some sort of a one-stop shop where they will essentially list products that have turned out to be not safe or that have displayed some malfunction. So in the future, you could imagine that clients or consumers that want to purchase a product, they can check there to see whether this product has a history of malfunction. But, for us, when you want to insure something, the safer the product is that you put originally on the market, the easier it is to insure it. At the end of the day, maybe the last point is also to talk about compulsory insurance. It was raised a number of times. You have raised it in your report. I think it is very important to recognize that compulsory insurance only works when a number of criteria are met. Also, it is easier to have compulsory insurance at national level, by far easier than trying to do that at European level, simply because the liability regimes, the national liability regimes across Europe are vastly different. And the way we look at some of the liability assessments is vastly different. So the preconditions that need to be met is availability of claims data. I go to cyber again. We do not have sufficient access to data breaches. We don't know exactly. All this will only come in through GDPR and the NIS directive next year. This is not yet available. We do not have access to that. So to assess a cyber risk without knowing what is the breach, the data breaches, is very difficult. Then we need a level of standardization to do compulsory insurance, and we need the insurance capacity. We have, by the way, developed a leaflet that I think is available in the room, an inside briefing that explains more details. I know we have a very limited time, so I think I will stop here, and if you have questions, happy to respond to it.
Anyway, it was very instructive. You give us concrete work which has to be done, because personally I cannot imagine new technology without an insurance or driverless car without insurance. But now I will give the floor to Hans Groh. He credited in law, but also in IT. He worked as a research assistant at the Catholic University of Louvain before becoming a lawyer at the Bar of Brussels, and he's a co-founder of an IT lawyer firm. Your team is very highly ranked, and I see that you participated in a large number of international ICT policy studies for the European Commission and European agencies. So I think you will have very interesting things to tell.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. So indeed, one of the main reasons why I'm here this evening is because we recently also did a study for the European Commission on access to data and liability for robotics and the Internet of Things. The presentation that I have this evening is not a presentation of that study, but obviously it does draw from elements that we've learned there, as well as from things that we've seen in the market ourselves as a law firm. I think to illustrate the first point that I want to make, and I'll try to be brief because I'm conscious of the time, I'd just like to take a step back and dive into history because I think it's important to keep the context here. I just was looking at some of the history behind robotics, and one of the interesting innovations that you can see in history is in 1886, a lady called Josephine Cochrane made an important invention. She invented the dishwasher. It was in 1886. A woman invented it, possibly not a coincidence. And one of the main reasons that she invented it was not because of economic savings or the economic potential, but she was actually sick of her housemates, of the servants, breaking her expensive dishes, which is ironic because personally, I as a man, my wife doesn't allow me to load the dishwasher with the expensive plates. I can load them with the cheap ones, but not with the expensive ones. From which you can only learn that housemaids are a very bad deal from a liability perspective, and robots can improve on that. What do I want, this point that I want to make? Actually, it kind of leads me to a point that Professor Sartor made in much more detail and much more eloquently. There is a point at which we no longer recognize robots as being robots. Why don't we recognize a dishwasher as being a robot? We saw a statistic in one of the earlier slides saying that even in more advanced countries, the number of robots per household is something like 0.002. Right, because we don't consider a dishwasher and a washing machine to be a robot. We don't recognize them as such. Still, they have a lot of characteristics of a robot. I put kitchen robots, the KitchenAid thing there as well, which is another thing that at least nobody in this room would say that's a robot. That's not a robot, that's just a machine. I put an assembly robot on the right-hand side, and that's where people say, sure, an assembly robot, that's a robot. Still, assembly robots have been around for a very long time. They didn't make us nervous. I also put there the Da Vinci surgery robot, which is another one of those things that comes up a lot because there's some case law, some history around surgical robots, and that's one of the good examples that make people nervous. But even those aren't necessarily too problematic. And in the Da Vinci case, the robots are more directly controlled by surgeons, but even in more advanced and more complicated cases, challenges don't necessarily arise. And in Belgium, actually, at the beginning of this year, we had a case that was published in the newspapers. We weren't involved as a law firm, so I can talk about it all I want. Was a case actually of a scanner, a brain scanner, that detected brain tumors and automatically applied radiation therapy to the victims. And it was miscalibrated. It was a big deal. A number of people actually got a bad treatment and their tumors worsened. So objectively, serious problem of a machine robot treating them. And it came before the courts, obviously, because patients sued for compensation. They sued the hospital, and they sued the machine manufacturer, and also the programmers who provided the programming logic behind the robots. And interestingly enough, the courts there said, you know, why are you making it so complicated? It was the hospital's job to treat you. You have a claim against the hospital, malpractice, hospital, pay them. We're not going to worry about what the liability was for the robotics provider. That's a contractual issue between the hospital and the robot manufacturer. It's important, it's clear, it's not a big deal that we need to very much worry about. The stuff that we are worried about is the non-deterministic robots, which Professor Sartor described more as autonomous robots. I personally like the concept of non-deterministic robots better because it explains more and effectively why we're scared of them. It's because for the other ones on the top of the row, we know what the inputs are, they're predictable, they work in a specific context, we understand the controls. The non-deterministic ones is where we're not entirely sure what kind of inputs they're going to get and what kind of decisions that they're going to make. So, you know, the self-flying drone delivery services, cars are an example of that. To some extent, even the lawnmower robots. Your lawn is not the same as mine. We're not entirely sure what will happen. I actually have more confidence in that since I saw a dog playing with a lawnmower robot, and they both seem to enjoy it. So apparently it's not such a huge risk. But it's important to realize that we're playing with a very different spectrum here. We've had robots for a very long time. The non-determinism is growing, and that's the part where risks arise. So I'm here to talk more about what kind of the legal issues are. I wanted to focus on two aspects, liability issues and the data protection issues. And I think right off the bat, it's worth saying that indeed, even for existing robots, we have regulations that work. We have product liability directive, general product safety, machinery directives, the entire family of the new approach directives on toy safety. Those have standards that need to be observed, and those can apply to robot products as well. I also don't think that we have a problem that the robots need to bear any kind of liability themselves, because it's also very tricky to do. As a lawyer, I know, and you also know, liability means that you can sue somebody for money, for damages. That means that in order to sue a robot, you need to give them money somehow. You need to put money behind that, otherwise liability of a robot doesn't really help you very much. That doesn't mean that it cannot possibly work. I put the logo there from the last time we faced this kind of issue, which was the 16th century when we invented the company in a nutshell. That's a logo there from the East Indies trading company, one of the first, not the first, but one of the first companies. That's when we invented the concept of, have a company, establish a company, put capital into that, and then the company can be directly liable. You could do the same thing with robots. I'm not convinced that it's a good idea, but you could indeed have a register with robots who are endowed with capital, who are underwritten, so that you can indeed hold robots directly liable. I don't think it's necessary, but it is a possibility. The bigger challenges that we have are linking the defects and faults that might occur, attributing them to a specific human or to a specific company to determine where was the fault occur and who has to be held liable for that. And we have a number of outdated concepts in our legislation that don't really work very well with non-deterministic robots. And product safety is all about, for instance, finding out what kind of safety you are entitled to expect as a user, as a consumer, as a citizen. What are you entitled to expect from a robot that can learn from itself, that can modify its own behavior, that can evolve to match its environment? We don't know, and we don't really have any rules for establishing that. We also know that these robots tend to work in very complex environments. They interact with each other, with other citizens, with people, with devices. We don't know exactly how that's going to work. One of the popular examples is self-driving cars. That's definitely going to happen. I'm sure that it will. And as soon as it happens, we'll have very safe cars, and we'll have idiots who will be jumping in front of self-driving cars because that will be the cool game, and they will want to put a video on YouTube. Do we need to design our self-driving cars to be able to deal with that scenario? What goes wrong there? Where do you place the liabilities there and the responsibilities? We also have to make sure that, we have to understand that very often the robots, the devices themselves are not the issue. Actually, typically they aren't. It's the way they are programmed. The surgical robot example from the case in Belgium that I gave is a great one. The robot was perfectly fine. The software that was loaded onto it was the problem. That creates a transparency issue. We, as citizens, will never be able to find out whether the problem was the device itself or the software or the cloud platform that was supposed to connect to, or even a fault in your internet connection. Right now, that's a very complicated exercise. Only experts might be able to find it out, but we won't. And that's a very different story for my kitchen robot. If my kitchen robot breaks down, I know what doesn't work. It's the kitchen robot. That's a very different situation with the self-driving car. So that's for the liability part. Data protection is also tricky. I think actually the main message here is that I'm personally kind of happy with the way the GDPR deals with this. I think it's a very good technology-neutral legislation. It's very good at promoting risk awareness, risk assessment, and taking appropriate measures. I think what we need as a society is a better understanding of what it is that we want and what it is that we expect, because right now we're getting surprised far too often. And an interesting example is the toy robots that have been all over the news as well, that your children can talk to, and then the robot will give them a response based on artificial intelligence. Their questions will get translated into the cloud, and they get hopefully a meaningful answer back. Or same kind of robots that essentially work as phones that allow kids to talk to their parents. That's great. We all love them. But we also know that this means that our children are being listened to when they have this toy around. We don't actually know what their data, what their conversations, where that's going to go and how that's going to be used. And we have a myriad of cases where this is going to come up with robotics. I put automated number plate recognition here. That's something that's coming up. Fingerprint recognition. When I bring my child to my daycare in the morning, they have a fingerprint scanning system. I can't get into the building anymore without having my fingerprint scanned. CCTVs, we're getting used to being monitored all the time. Robots, in order to be able to interact with our environments, are going to be filming everything all the time. Are we okay with that? We can regulate that from a privacy perspective. It already falls under the GDPR. The tricky issue is that as a society, we don't agree yet to the extent that this is a good idea. We don't know yet how to apply those rules. That's a discussion we need to have. That's not a legal problem. That's not a regulatory problem. That's a societal issue. And then just closing points, just brainstorming a little bit, what might be the gaps and how can we fix those? How can you address those? Like I said, I'm not a huge fan, actually, of having direct liability of robots. I'm actually not even a huge fan of trying to target robots specifically with legislation because it creates bad incentives. What I mean by that is companies are going to try to argue that they are the dishwasher or the kitchen aid and not self-driving cars. They will try to wiggle out of the definition of robots. And I'm sure everybody on this panel has had the experience. It's infernally difficult to come up with a definition of robot that is acceptable and that doesn't create bad negative impacts. What you could do, and it's just a couple of small suggestions, is have stricter liability rules for products in general that have what I've called here an elevated risk profile. So basically those would be any kind of products that create additional risks to their environment because of lack of bounds in their behavior. Lack of bounds meaning because they are geographically unrestricted, they can move around at will without any person controlling them, or because they can learn different things depending on what happens to them without any appropriate thresholds for that. There you can have additional requirements. For instance, the requirement to have a black box logging the activities, logging the interactions, just putting cautions on the device indicating, we don't know what this device is going to do. You might want to keep an eye out for it, or mandating insurance for a commercial use of that. That would be one option. We also put regulatory sandboxing here. You need to be able to experiment with these kinds of devices. Some countries already do that. They allow experimentation. They temporarily suspend the rules in order to allow these kinds of robots to be tested. We don't do that at the European level, and that's a recipe for disaster. If we're going to have self-driving cars, please let's make sure that they can drive all over the EU and that they don't stop at a border because they say, I haven't been tested here. We need to start doing regulatory sandboxing, testing these devices at the European level. Better practices for safety assessment and certifications has been mentioned, so I won't go back into that. And one last thing that I wanted to mention is for these kinds of robots, or my preferred approach, products with an elevated risk profile, you could also mandate the use of risk assessments, basically following what the GDPR does, saying you can produce these, you can bring them to the market, but you have to conduct, as a manufacturer, a risk assessment, or as a service provider using these devices, a risk assessment, identifying what the main problems are, what damages could occur, what ethical challenges could occur as well, risk for discrimination, risks of unfair treatment, lack of transparency, and what you've done to mitigate those. Require those even, I mentioned here, to even publish those or extracts of those so that people know what they're buying into. And I think these are relatively small fixes that don't require fundamental overhauls of the legal system, but that might be successful in mitigating some of these issues. And that's, I think, where I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you for this very impressive presentation. I have already Mr. Stramigioli who wants to ask a question.
Compliment for the last talk. Excellent framework and the way you describe it. I would like to basically make a comment on what you say and about it and related to some previous speaker. I mean, medical robots, for example. Okay, so you made a big important distinction because medical robots like Da Vinci or robots, for example, the European Commission is funding a project I'm coordinating for breast cancer, which is going to be very, very useful for breast cancer. And there is no autonomy in that respect up to a certain level. How you combine it? The thing I want to say is determinism, which is related to my second slide I gave, is the fact that AI is not determinism, is what kind of freedom you leave in your autonomy before you actually have actions that can autonomously intervene to prevent that it goes further. So AI cannot predict that, right? AI you cannot predict it, but you can use watchdogs based on proper physics that basically supervise that, and when something goes wrong, brings the system in a kind of safe state. And those are the law of Asimov, if you wish, on a micro scale.
Thank you for these remarks. I am very sorry, but we can continue the discussion with some wine. Because I would like to thank the interpreters because they stop at 6:30. So thank you for the very, very interesting panel. And I give you have 1 minute left.
Well, I want to thank everybody. I think it was an intense and informative afternoon until the evening. And we have much feed for thought for the next weeks and months to come. I think one resume is we should not be pessimistic or fearful. I believe we should release this issue from being captive in Fantasyland. It's not something for Fantasyland, it's something for reality. So we should put it back on its feet. And I think this was the first attempt to do that. In our digital working group, we are trying this. There will be a next, maybe interesting event for you on the 7th of December on social implications of digital economy. This is around the same topic, so if you are interested, please feel free to come. So thank you very much for everybody who took part in these discussions, who contributed, especially the speakers, and of course the S&T staff. Václav Ms. and Mayor Murphy did a great job, so thank you very much, and now you're invited for some or many drinks. Thank you. So danke, das war wirklich